I never thought I'd find myself in Alaska, let alone the rugged reaches of the Kenai Peninsula, but sometimes the universe pushes you toward the very place you fear. In my case, it was grief that drove me here, a tragedy back home that I hadn't been able to outrun. The noise of the world seemed to mock the silence in my heart, so I traded it all. The bustle of city life, my job as a deckhand in the lower 48, for an old off-grid cabin off Resurrection Creek Road. I arrived in early September, the brief Alaskan autumn already preparing to yield to winter's icy grip. I almost didn't make it to the cabin. My battered truck groaned the entire way from Anchorage, its tires skidding on roads turned muddy by light rain. When the GPS flickered out of service, I resorted to a handwritten set of directions I'd scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt. The final few miles followed a narrow dirt path hugging the edges of dense spruce trees, their silhouettes looming in the twilight. Just when I feared the road would end in a tangle of branches, it opened onto a small clearing. The cabin hunkered there, modest and solitary, a silent witness to the wild that stretched all around. Its logs were dark with age, the windows shuttered with rough-hewn planks. A wooden porch jutted from the front, half swallowed by encroaching brush. I felt a knot in my chest loosen at the sight. This was what I'd wanted. A place too far for anyone to casually drop by. A place to face my memories on my own terms. Before the sun fully set, I hauled my boxes and gear inside. The cabin's interior was simple. A single room with a wood stove in one corner, a small table, and a cot. I flipped a switch, forgetting I was off-grid now. Of course, there was no electricity. Outside, I'd spotted a battered generator that might or might not work, plus some makeshift solar panels angled at the low sun. I sighed, rummaging for my lantern. When I found it, a wave of relief flickered through me at the soft glow. The first night passed quietly enough. I ate canned chili over a small propane stove and listened to the wind scrape branches against the roof. I kept expecting my phone to vibrate with a notification, a message from someone who knew me, but there was nothing, just the emptiness I'd chosen. I tried to find comfort in that silence, telling myself it was better this way. A few days later, I met Katrina Wayne. I'd been chopping firewood by the side of the cabin, the hatchet's rhythmic thunk echoing among the trees, when I saw movement on the trail. I stiffened, not expecting any visitors. A lean figure emerged from the spruce. A woman in her mid-30s, dark hair knotted into a bun, a camera slung around her neck. She held up a gloved hand in greeting. "Hey there," she called. "Didn't mean to startle you. Just passing through, taking photos of wildlife." I lowered the hatchet, catching my breath. No worries. Didn't know anyone else wandered this way. She gave a faint smile. I like the quiet. We chatted briefly. Katrina introduced herself as a wildlife photographer on assignment, curious about the region's moose and brown bears. She looked at my pile of wood and the half-finished ring of logs around the cabin. "You live here full-time?" she asked, sounding half impressed, half wary. I hesitated before nodding. Just moved in. Needed space. She didn't pry, just said, "Be careful. This part of the Kenai can feel lonely." Then she left, disappearing as quickly as she'd come. The loneliness didn't bother me, until the first night I sensed something watching me. It was late. The sky blanketed in stars, the cold creeping around the cabin's edges. I'd cracked a window to let out some of the wood stove's excess heat when I heard a faint cry, carried on the wind. I froze, unsure if I'd imagined it. It sounded like someone calling my name, Mark, drawn out in a long whisper. I tried to rationalize it as the wind's trick, but the next evening I heard it again, just after dusk. My name, drifting through the pines. My heart thudded painfully. When I flung open the door and shone a flashlight, the beam cut through swirling mists of my own breath, revealing only silent trees. I told myself it must be grief playing tricks on me, that I was hearing what I wanted, or feared to hear. The footprints came next. I woke one morning to find fresh tracks in the soft earth by the porch, but they weren't quite human. The outline resembled a barefoot print, yet the toes were elongated, the stride too long. I stood over them, numb with confusion. Bears? Wolves? Definitely not. Some large predator? Possibly. But the sense of something off gnawed at me. I decided to visit old Elias, a reclusive neighbor I'd been warned about by the man who sold me the cabin. He's been out there forever, the man had said. Knows more about the land than anyone, but he's odd. It took me half a day to hike to his shack, following a faint path that led deeper into the forest. Eventually, I arrived at a tumble-down structure next to a frozen creek. An old man with piercing gray eyes stood on the porch, arms crossed. "You're the new occupant of the river's cabin," he said, voice raspy. "Didn't figure you'd last a week before coming to see me." I introduced myself, hesitantly explaining the strange footprints and the voices. Old Elias listened, expression unchanging. Then he spat into the snow. "Canines full of spirits. Some are benign, some not. You got guilt on your shoulders, boy." Taken aback, I stammered. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "They feed on that. The sorrow, the regrets, gets under your skin, twists what you see and hear." I felt a chill deeper than the Alaskan cold. "So, it's all in my head?" He gave me a piercing look. "Not necessarily. Could be you're drawing something to you. A revenant, maybe, or just a hungry spirit. Keep your mind strong, or it'll take you under." I walked back in a daze. Elias's words rattled me. My guilt was no secret. I'd lost my son to an accident I might have prevented. That regret clung to me every waking second, fueling the nightmares I'd fled by coming here. Had I somehow attracted a presence with my despair? The thought felt absurd, but I couldn't shake it. The next week was a gauntlet of unease. At night, I'd hear whispers that sounded like my son's voice, or see a shape flit between the spruces when I peered out the window. More footprints appeared around the cabin, swirling in the snowdrifts. Katrina showed up once more, dropping by to share coffee and ask if I'd seen any moose. I was so on edge I barely formed coherent sentences, but I forced myself to tell her about the weird footprints. Her face tightened with concern. "I've heard stories," she said. "Local lore about shapeshifters, or spirits that mimic voices. Didn't think much of it, but maybe be cautious." One late afternoon, I stepped outside to gather firewood and nearly jumped out of my skin. A large fish, half-gutted, lay on my porch, its eyes staring blankly. Blood smeared the rough planks. There were prints leading away into the trees. Again, that elongated shape. Something had left me a grisly gift. I shuddered, dragging the fish carcass away, burying it in snow to mask the smell. My teeth clacked from fear more than cold. Determined to figure out what I was dealing with, I hiked to the nearest library in Hope, a small settlement half an hour's drive away, if the roads permitted. The library was just a modest building with a handful of local history books. I pored over anything referencing spirits or legends in southern Alaska. One battered volume mentioned the Kalupalik, an Inuit legend of child-stealing creatures from the water. Another described the Kushtaka, shape-changing otter spirits. None seemed to match precisely what I was experiencing, but all hinted at malevolent entities drawn to sorrow or isolation. Back at the cabin, I tried sleeping with the lights on, though that only made me feel exposed. Night after night, the whispering returned. Sometimes it took the tone of my son crying for help. Other times it was just my name, repeated until I wanted to scream. I'd grab my flashlight and shotgun, run outside, find nothing but swirling snow. At my wit's end, I decided to confide in Katrina more fully. She had an air of calm I envied. Maybe, as an outdoors woman, she'd know a solution. I felt embarrassed. I was the one who'd come here for solitude, but I needed help. She met me at my cabin one afternoon, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. Over cups of instant coffee, I spilled the truth about my son's death and the guilt that had strangled me for years. She listened quietly, her eyes full of sympathy. When I lost my father, she said slowly, I blamed myself for not being there. For years, I dreamt I heard his voice calling me. Maybe the land is amplifying your grief, or maybe there really is something here feeding on it. In Alaska, the line between the natural and supernatural can feel thin. She suggested we document the nights, using her cameras and audio equipment to see if anything tangible turned up. That evening, we set up motion-activated cameras around the porch, plus an audio recorder near the window I usually left cracked. Then we hunkered inside, flashlights and shotgun within reach. For hours, we heard nothing but the crackle of the wood stove and our own ragged breathing. Around 2 a.m., a faint thump sounded on the wall. We froze. Another thump, then a voice, muffled as though coming from under the floor. My name again, Mark, drawn out in a low hiss. Katrina's face turned white. She nodded, and I crept toward the door. The moment I turned the knob, the voice stopped. In the hush, I heard the clatter of one of our cameras toppling. I flung the door open, stepping onto the porch, the cold biting my cheeks. The motion sensor lights kicked on, illuminating a figure at the far edge of the clearing. Tall, lanky, limbs slightly too long. Its face was indistinguishable, just a pale blur. A guttural growl rumbled from its chest. Katrina gasped behind me, camera snapping photos in quick succession. I raised the shotgun, heart pounding, but before I could even think to fire a warning shot, the figure loped into the trees with inhuman speed. We dashed after it, adrenaline pumping, but it disappeared into the darkness. Our breath plumed in the frosty air. The forest was silent. Back inside, we reviewed the footage. One camera had captured a blurred silhouette creeping along the porch. Another recorded the sound of a faint voice, but none provided a clear glimpse of its features. We only confirmed that something definitely lurked around my cabin. A tall, twisted presence, physically real, yet seemingly unnatural. At dawn, I dragged out the old generator from the shed and spent the day wiring extra lights around the perimeter. I poured rock salt along the porch, not sure if it would do anything, but some folklore recommended it. When I next spoke with old Elias, he told me salt and bright light might deter a hungry spirit. But if it's latched onto your grief, you gotta face what's inside you, boy, he warned. All the lights in Alaska won't chase away a demon anchored to your soul. Those words echoed in my head. Maybe I did need to confront my guilt directly, but I wasn't sure how. The day wore on, turning to twilight. Katrina stayed until nightfall, helping me test the lights. They blazed the clearing like a stage. My chest relaxed a fraction. I hoped the creature would keep its distance. Unfortunately, that night the temperature plunged, and the lights flickered on and off, the old generator sputtering. Around midnight, it finally died. A wave of dread slammed through me as darkness devoured the clearing. I heard a distant cry again, then footsteps skirting the cabin walls. Katrina and I huddled inside, each holding a flashlight beam that danced across the windows. At 2 a.m., something hammered on the door so hard it rattled. I shouted, "Leave me alone!" but it only banged louder. My chest clenched in terror. Katrina grabbed the shotgun, indicating she'd handle it. As soon as she lifted the barrel, the banging stopped. We heard a snarl, then retreating steps. I exhaled shakily, tears burning my eyes. The next morning, I made a decision. I would try a cleansing ritual. I might not believe in all the old tales, but if the spirit thrived on my guilt, maybe some symbolic act could break its hold. Katrina, reluctant to leave me alone, volunteered to help gather sage or anything else that might be used. We consulted old Elias. He gave us a pungent bundle of dried plants and some instructions. Burn this at sunset. Circle your cabin. Speak aloud that your guilt no longer chains you. It sounded half superstitious, half sincere. If it's your grief it wants, starve it by forgiving yourself, he added, a rare note of empathy in his gravelly voice. At sunset, Katrina and I lit the bundle of sage and circled the cabin, smoke curling through the crisp air. My voice shook as I spoke. I forgive myself for what I couldn't control. This is my home now. I banish whatever darkness clings to me. The words felt awkward, but I forced them out. My thoughts filled with my son's face, the memory of the accident, the crushing guilt I'd carried. My throat tightened, tears slipping down my cheeks. I kept going, step by step, until we'd circled back to the porch. The wind picked up, swirling the smoke around us. For a second, I thought I saw the figure crouched at the forest's edge, its pale face twisted in a sneer. Katrina grasped my shoulder, and I squeezed the last words out. I choose to live. Then it was gone, or at least not visible. The night that followed was tense, but no banging, no voices. We stayed awake until dawn, heartbeats drumming in our ears. When the generator kicked back on the next morning, flooding the clearing with light, I almost laughed with relief. The final test came a couple of nights later. Katrina had headed out on a photography trip, leaving me alone in the cabin. I lay in my cot, silent, waiting for the creature's footsteps. Around midnight, the wind howled. My lantern sputtered. Then I heard something outside, soft scraping as though claws on wood. My pulse soared, but I got up calmly, opened the door. Nothing but darkness. No footprints, no fish carcasses. The air smelled fresh, untainted by fear. I stood there for a long minute, exhaling into the frigid night, half expecting to see that twisted silhouette charge at me. Instead, the forest was empty and still, just as I'd wished it. It's been a month since then. Katrina still visits, sharing coffee and stories about wildlife sightings. We compare notes on what we experienced, marveling at how real it all felt. Old Elias occasionally stops by, wordlessly dropping off kindling or bits of smoked salmon. Each day, I gather more confidence, reinforcing the cabin, chopping firewood, even letting myself enjoy the grandeur of the Kenai Peninsula. I won't say my guilt is gone. That's not how grief works. But I've found some measure of peace. The terrifying presence that stalked me seems to have lost its power once I took the step of facing what I'd been running from. Maybe that's all it ever was. A manifestation of my sorrow, amplified by this wild land's ancient energies. Or maybe a malevolent spirit truly sought to feast on my anguish. Either way, I remain. And in remaining, I'm learning that even in the cold hush of Alaska's wilderness, healing can grow. Each morning, I watch the sun creep over the mountains, and I think of my son with love instead of crippling shame. The cabin is silent, but it no longer suffocates me. I've chosen life, and in doing so, I've banished whatever wanted to devour me in the shadows. The Kenai wind still whispers at night, but it no longer carries my name. In that quiet, I find a strange comfort. I'm alive, forging ahead, and maybe that's enough. I never planned to end up in Maine. My life, up until a few months ago, revolved around the chaotic hum of a busy hospital in downtown Boston, where I worked 12-hour shifts in the ER. Time blurred into an endless stream of injuries, frantic calls for help, and bleary-eyed nights. I carried that burden until I couldn't anymore, until the echo of alarms followed me into my dreams, and the faces of patients I couldn't save haunted my thoughts even when I tried to sleep. My friends said I was burned out, that I needed a break. My supervisor told me to take a leave. I took it, and once I stepped away from the hospital's sliding doors, I knew I needed to go somewhere far from the city's noise. That's how I found myself driving toward Bar Harbor, Maine, with little more than a map, a backpack of clothes, and the address of a cottage near Acadia National Park. The rental was cheap, especially in the off-season when tourists cleared out and the cold Atlantic winds set in. The listing boasted spectacular pine forests, a quiet retreat, but I barely paid attention to the details. I just knew I needed pine-scented air and the lullaby of ocean tides to drown out the beep of heart monitors still echoing in my head. I arrived on a chilly afternoon. The roads were empty of tourists, and the quaint shops in Bar Harbor displayed closed for the season signs. A light drizzle coated my windshield, and as I followed the twisting road out of town, it felt like I was leaving civilization behind. The cottage sat a few miles off the main highway, near a remote section of Acadia's pine woodlands. I spotted a small, rough driveway partly obscured by tall evergreens. The gravel crunched under my tires, leading me to a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch. Beside it, the forest rose in a vast wall of green and brown, trees swaying in the faint wind. It wasn't much. 2 small rooms, minimal furniture, and a rusted wood stove in the corner. The roof leaked, which I discovered within 5 minutes of walking inside. A steady drip splashed into a bucket the previous occupant had left behind. The floor felt damp, and the walls smelled faintly of mildew. My breath caught in my throat as I dropped my bag by the door. Was I really going to make this place home for the next few weeks? Or months? I reminded myself that I'd come here to find peace. I'd deal with the damp, the cold, the mold, if it meant some measure of quiet. So I pulled on a sweater and started unpacking. As I set up my meager belongings, a few clothes, a sleeping bag, some groceries, a sense of uneasy relief settled over me. Maybe this was the right move. A part of me worried that without the constant demands of the ER, I'd be left alone with all the painful memories. But maybe that was necessary for me to heal. That first night, I learned how dark Maine could get in the off-season. With no streetlights for miles, the pines swallowed what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. I huddled near the wood stove, turning logs over to keep the fire going. My phone had a single bar of signal, enough to send a brief text to a friend in Boston. I'm here, safe, very quiet. Will keep you posted. As I waited for sleep, the hush of the forest enveloped me, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. My mind replayed the memory of a patient in respiratory distress from weeks ago, her eyes wide with panic, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, matching the rhythm of the flickering flames. Morning brought a gray drizzle, just enough to turn the pine needles slippery underfoot. I decided to explore, so I threw on my jacket and boots and walked toward Acadia's park boundary. A few minutes into the trail, I came across a sign marking the entrance to a ranger station. Smoke curled gently from the chimney of a small cabin. That's where I met Jim Lockett, a park ranger who was mending a split-rail fence. Tall, sandy-haired, and with a calm presence, he gave me a curious look when I approached. "You lost?" he asked, setting down a hammer. "Just exploring," I answered. "I'm staying in a cottage a little ways down the road." He introduced himself, explaining that he oversaw a portion of Acadia's trails in this quieter section of the park. When I told him my name and that I was a nurse looking for peace, he gave a wry smile. "You're in the right place if you want solitude," he said. "But be careful. It's easy to get turned around in these woods, especially off-season when there's nobody around." We chatted a bit. I liked Jim's grounded demeanor. Nothing like the urgent, high-stress environment I'd left behind. He seemed suspicious, though, when I mentioned the old cottage, as if he'd heard stories about it. But he didn't press the issue. Instead, He just cautioned me about black ice on the trails and moose wandering the roads at night. I thanked him and continued hiking, the soft carpet of pine needles damp beneath my boots. The forest smelled earthy, and a thin layer of mist clung to the undergrowth. It was beautiful and sad all at once, reminding me of how nature doesn't need an audience to exist. It just is. The knowledge humbled me, a reminder that my own sorrows were just a small part of the world's tapestry. A few days passed in relative stillness. I'd wake up early, fight the chill by lighting a fire in the wood stove, then spend the day walking, reading, or writing in a journal. Sometimes I'd drive into Bar Harbor to restock supplies and find the place nearly deserted, the once bustling streets now home to a handful of locals who eyed me with mild curiosity. Each evening, the wind through the pines lulled me to an uneasy sleep. Then the oddities began. Late one night, I heard a faint cry outside my window, like a child's or maybe a woman's. I shot upright from a shallow doze, heart pounding. Straining to listen, I caught the echo of sobbing, carried on the wind. I told myself it was just the sound of the breeze against the eaves. But the next night, I heard it again, around the same time. A low, mournful weeping somewhere in the forest. The third night, I couldn't stand it any longer. Wrapped in a coat over my pajamas, I stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The drizzle had turned into a light rain, pattering on leaves. "Hello?" I called, shining the beam across the yard. The darkness pressed in, revealing only the silhouettes of pine trunks swaying in the damp. No reply, just the steady drip of water. Shivering, I retreated inside, closing the door firmly. It was the footprints that truly unsettled me. One morning, heading out to fetch firewood, I found footprints in the mud near my porch. Barefoot impressions, small as a child's, yet the spacing suggested an adult's stride. They led from the side of the cottage around to the back wall, then vanished by a patch of brambles. My scalp prickled. Who walked around my place barefoot in the cold rain? I tried to remember if I'd heard anything in the night other than the sobbing. My gut twisted. I told myself it could be local kids playing a prank, but that explanation fell flat. There was no sign of other footprints, no adult shoes, no small boots, just those bare feet, as if a ghost had tiptoed through the mud. I recalled the sadness in the night air, the weeping I kept hearing. It felt connected, though I couldn't see how. With my anxiety creeping up, I drove to town in search of answers. At the local library, an elderly librarian named Marianne Frost noticed my troubled expression. She asked if she could help, so I awkwardly explained I was seeking any local folklore about ghosts or strange occurrences near my rental cottage. Her bright eyes lit with intrigue, and she beckoned me to a dusty shelf in the library's back room. She pulled out a slim volume titled Histories of Coastal Maine, Myths and Mysteries, flipping pages until she found a reference to the area near Bar Harbor. The entry spoke of an old settlement from colonial times, where small homesteads dotted the forest fringe. A wave of epidemics struck in the 1700s, claiming many lives, including children. Some local Wabanaki stories intertwined with European tales, leading to beliefs in restless spirits who wandered the pines. Marianne tapped the page gently. People around here sometimes talk about a young spirit who roams the woods near the old homesteads, crying at night, she said, glancing at me. If you're staying in that particular part of the forest, you may be hearing her. I felt a chill race down my spine. I confessed about the footprints, the midnight sobbing, how it all seemed to converge on my cottage. Marianne gave me a sympathetic look. Some folks say she was separated from her family, never found her way home. It's a sad tale, though I suspect many versions of it exist. She paused, then offered, "If it is a spirit, perhaps it only wants recognition." Unsure how to react, I thanked her and left. On the drive back, I mulled over the possibility that a ghostly child wandered the pine woods. Logic insisted it was nonsense, but the footprints and sobbing haunted my thoughts. I stopped at the ranger station on a whim, hoping to see Jim again. Maybe he'd have a rational explanation, like a rogue camper or an animal that made prints resembling small feet. Jim listened carefully as I described the footprints and nightly crying, concern etching his features. "I've heard of folks reporting strange noises out there," he admitted, "but I've never seen actual footprints like that. Could be an animal, but I'm not aware of any with prints that look so human." He hesitated, then asked, "You sure you're not?" He trailed off, probably wanting to avoid sounding offensive. "Hallucinating?" I finished for him. "I'm not sure. I've been under stress, but I know what I saw. I have photos." My face burned, feeling defensive. Jim nodded. "I believe you. Let me come out to your place tonight. We can keep watch together, see if we notice anything." His willingness to help calmed me, though I felt a spark of embarrassment at needing a stranger's assistance. That evening, Jim arrived with a thermos of coffee and a pair of flashlights. We sat on my porch, huddled under the overhang while drizzle pattered around us. The air smelled richly of pine and wet earth. We spoke quietly about how we both ended up here. He'd left a bigger national park in Colorado because he loved Maine's rugged coast. I'd fled a hospital that had become too much to bear. The conversation lulled until the hush of the forest pressed in. Close to midnight, a faint sob drifted through the trees. Jim stiffened, exchanging a glance with me. We carefully stood and stepped into the yard, flashlights skimming across the trunk of a large pine. The sobbing intensified, moving away from us like a frightened animal. We followed the sound, picking our way over slick roots and moss. After a few minutes, the crying stopped, leaving us in a patch of dense forest. No sign of footprints this time, though a swirl of mist curled around our ankles. We called out gently, "Hello? Do you need help?" Silence. A gust of wind rattled the branches. We waited, breath steaming in the cold air, until Jim finally muttered that we should head back. As we returned, I noticed deep scratches on one side of the cottage's exterior, 3 jagged lines, as if a child with impossibly sharp nails had raked the wood. They hadn't been there before. My stomach clenched. Jim's expression hardened. The next morning, I found the old footprints from earlier were gone, washed away by rain, but new ones had appeared near the place we'd heard the sobbing. They looped back around the side of the cottage, as though circling us. I shuddered at the idea of something watching me from the shadows while I slept. Desperate to put my mind at ease, I contacted Marianne again. She said that in Wabanaki tradition, lost spirits sometimes needed a release ceremony, an acknowledgement that they had died. "They may be stuck here, not realizing their time has passed," she explained, "or they might be replaying their sorrow." She advised me to try offering respect rather than fear or hostility. It sounded like a mix of spiritual practice and folklore, but I was willing to try anything. That same evening, Jim and I built a small fire in a clearing behind the cottage, where the pine trees ringed us in a natural circle. Marianne came too, bringing a handful of local herbs and a hand-bound notebook of old prayers. I watched with a lump in my throat as we sprinkled salt around the fire, then placed a small wooden toy I'd found in the cottage's attic, a forgotten trinket, possibly from a child of years past, into the flames. Marianne read a short passage from her notebook, calling on any lost souls to find peace and rest. The wind picked up, swirling sparks around us. The air grew cold, a prickling sensation on my skin. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a flicker of movement beyond the firelight, the outline of a young girl in a threadbare dress, her face half hidden by shadows. My pulse thundered. I blinked, and she was gone, as though swallowed by the gloom. Then the sobbing started, echoing from everywhere, soft and heart-wrenching. tears pricked at my own eyes. Marianne's voice shook as she continued the prayer, asking for the spirit to be released from pain. Gradually, the crying faded, replaced by the lonely sigh of the wind. The fire crackled, sending sparks skyward. None of us spoke for a long moment, listening to the night. Finally, Jim squeezed my shoulder, and Marianne let out a trembling breath. We doused the fire, scattering the ashes in the undergrowth. I felt utterly drained, yet strangely lighter. The days that followed were quieter. At night, the pine boughs still rattled, and the drizzle occasionally turned into sleet, but I heard no more sobbing. The footprints ceased. In fact, the yard stayed undisturbed, mud patches unsullied by bare feet. It felt as though the presence had been lifted, or at least calmed. Part of me struggled to believe I'd played a role in releasing a ghost, but the change in atmosphere was undeniable. The sadness that once gnawed at my nerves seemed to recede. I celebrated by painting the cottage's walls, scrubbing away the mold and patching the roof. Jim visited more often, sometimes bringing groceries or just to chat. We'd walk the trails together, or sit on the porch listening to the hush of the off-season forest. My nightmares about the ER's frantic alarms still came, but less frequently, and I discovered that focusing on the pine-scented breeze was a better sleeping aid than any prescription. Marianne checked in as well, curious if anything else had happened. When I told her it had been peaceful, she smiled and told me I'd done a good deed. Yet, a small part of me wondered if the spirit might ever return, if sorrow could truly be released, or just transformed. Sometimes, especially when a gust of wind rattled the walls, I thought I heard a faint echo of that sobbing, but then it would vanish, replaced by the everyday sounds of Maine's wilderness. I realized that perhaps, like my own trauma, it would never fully go away. Healing wasn't about erasing the pain, but learning to live with its memory. As winter deepened, ice glazed the cottage steps, and a fresh blanket of snow turned the pines into silhouettes of white. I stood outside one morning, letting the chill fill my lungs, and gazed at my little refuge. I felt a gentle gratitude for what I'd found here, the quiet I needed, the acceptance of my own haunted memories, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, I'd helped another lost soul find rest. I started thinking about returning to nursing, but maybe in a smaller clinic or a community health setting, some place that wouldn't crush my spirit under perpetual emergencies. Jim encouraged me, saying the region always needed medical professionals. He offered to introduce me to folks in the nearby towns. I told him I wasn't ready yet, but maybe in time. There was no rush. I had to mend at my own pace. One night, as I closed the shutters against a rising wind, I paused to stare into the darkness. The forest looked still, save for the dancing shadows of trees. For an instant, I thought I saw a faint silhouette in a clearing beyond the yard, like the fleeting shape of a child. Instead of fear, I felt a gentle sadness. My breath formed a cloud on the cold air. Then I whispered a soft goodbye, truly meaning it. The figure, if it existed, melted into the gloom. I shut the shutters, heart full. Tomorrow I'd continue renovating, maybe give the cottage a fresh coat of paint, a sign of new beginnings. The sorrow that once hung over this place had receded, replaced by a cautious hope. Maybe that's the best we can do in life, move through the ghosts that haunt us, whether they're from centuries past or from our own personal histories. I crawled into bed, listening to the hush of the pines outside. This time, I heard no weeping, only the quiet whispers of the wind telling me I wasn't alone. And, for the first time in a long while, I believed it. I never thought I'd settle in a place like this, an arid stretch of land near the Rio Grande, where the sun beats down so fiercely it feels like an anvil on your back. But after years in the oil fields, something in me cracked. Maybe it was the guilt of watching the land get scarred, or the emptiness I felt each time I returned to a cramped motel room after a shift. Whatever the cause, I packed up my truck, sold off most of my possessions, and decided to live off-grid near Big Bend National Park. My friends called me crazy. My sister Sophia begged me to think twice, but I was done explaining. I craved quiet. I wanted to see if I could build a life on my own terms, in the wide, unforgiving silence of the desert. I followed dusty roads farther and farther from civilization until I found a few acres of cheap land nobody else seemed to want. The boundaries were marked by rusted wire fences and dried-up creek beds. With the last of my savings, I bought an old RV shell that a friend had converted into a makeshift cabin. It had solar panels bolted to the roof, a small water tank, and a rudimentary shower rig. Not exactly glamorous, but it was enough. At least, that's what I told myself. The first morning, I woke to a brilliant sunrise that turned the desert sky into a swirl of pink and orange. The air was still and hot, even at dawn, promising another searing day. I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and marveled at the rugged peaks of Big Bend in the distance. I thought, this is freedom. No more shrieking alarm clocks, no more rig supervisors barking orders. Just me and the desert. I almost smiled, but the desert doesn't offer simple solace. It can be as harsh as any environment I've known, draining the body and mind. My solar setup barely powered a small fan to cut through the heat. I rationed water carefully, making weekly trips to a distant truck stop where I could fill a couple of drums. The dryness cracked my lips, and the wind whipped sand against the RV, leaving faint scratch marks on the paint. Yet I stuck it out. A voice in my head insisted I deserved this purgatory, after all I'd taken from the earth during my oil field days. A few weeks in, my sister Sophia decided to check on me. She arrived in her old sedan, dust coating the windshield, looking half worried and half relieved to find me alive. I'd rigged an awning of tarps over some poles, offering a bit of shade where we could sit in rickety lawn chairs. She fussed about the heat, the lack of comfort, and my ragged appearance. I shrugged, telling her I had everything under control, but her eyes flicked over the sun-scorched ground and the peeling paint on the RV, and I could see she wasn't convinced. That afternoon, we drove into the park. Sophia snapped pictures of the dramatic cliffs and winding river that cut through the canyons. It felt good, showing her why I'd come here. The raw beauty of the desert, the hush that settled when the wind died. Even she couldn't deny the awe of it. We parted ways with me promising I'd call if I needed anything. I meant it, though a stubborn part of me bristled at the idea of asking for help. Alone again, I settled into a routine of early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the worst of the midday heat. I worked on reinforcing the RV's insulation, used spare lumber to craft a makeshift deck, and tried growing a few desert-hardy plants in raised beds. Mostly, they just shriveled, but I kept tinkering, mixing local soil with store-bought compost in hopes something might survive. Pride kept me from admitting I was in over my head. The dryness, the punishing sun, it all weighed on me, like the land was testing how serious I was about redemption. One evening, I trekked down a wash in search of a rumored spring or seep. The map I had was old, and the land had probably changed 100 times in the last few decades, but I needed a better water source than the truck stop. That's when I stumbled upon Bo Delgado, a lean, sun-baked local guide who was resting under a scrubby mesquite tree. He nodded in greeting. No hint of surprise at seeing me. "You that fellow living off-grid by mile marker 22, right?" he asked. I admitted I was. Bo said he'd heard about me from a rancher who occasionally drove through. Apparently, word traveled fast in these parts. I explained my situation, my search for water. Bo studied the horizon, then told me the spring dried up long ago. Still, He offered to show me a place where water sometimes pooled after a rare rain. I followed him along an old trail, stepping over rocks and cacti. As we walked, Bo talked about local legends. I brushed it off as desert lore at first. He mentioned brujeria, old curses, and shapeshifters rumored to wander the borderlands. I'd heard enough tall tales in the oil fields to know people loved to spin stories. But something about Bo's voice was matter-of-fact, not embellished. We reached a rocky depression where a trickle of water reflected the evening sky. Bo crouched, scooping some into his calloused hands. "Too salty for drinking," he said. "But animals come here at night. Be careful out here after dark." His gaze flicked to the horizon. "Some folks say the desert can reveal your secrets, your guilt. You might see things you don't expect." I laughed it off. "I'll take my chances," I said. But a chill crept down my spine. It made no sense to feel cold in that scorching place, yet I did. We parted ways, and I headed back to the RV, dismissing his stories as local superstition. But that night, I woke to a strange chill despite the stagnant heat. A mist seemed to seep into the edges of my vision. Not literal fog. This was the desert in summer, after all, but a swirling haze that hovered just beyond the corners of my sight. I blinked, convinced it was exhaustion, maybe dehydration. Yet the feeling of cold lingered, and for a moment I thought I heard a soft hiss, like wind through a narrow crevice. In the morning, I found footprints outside my RV door, leading away into the sand. They weren't mine, too large and oddly shaped, as if the toes had elongated tips. My gut tightened. Could it be a wandering coyote or mountain lion? The tracks looked almost human, but not quite. I tried to brush it off as a trick of shifting soil, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't vanish. I chalked up the next few nights' disturbances to my overactive imagination. The plastic tarp overhead flapped in the breeze, making me jump. Shadows cast by the moon seemed to shift in ways I couldn't explain. Once, around 2 a.m, I heard a distant, guttural cry echo across the desert, like no coyote or bobcat I'd ever heard. I'd spent enough time outdoors to recognize typical wildlife calls, and this wasn't anything normal. It unsettled me so much I barely slept the rest of the night. A couple of days later, Sophia came back for a visit. She found me bleary-eyed and jumpy. Over a cup of instant coffee, I confessed that something felt off in the desert. She gave me that sisterly look of concern, asked if I was lonely or depressed. Maybe, I thought. Maybe my mind's just playing tricks. But I showed her the footprints, or what remained of them in the shifting sand, and the half-burned mesquite branch I found on my deck without explanation. It smelled acrid, like chemicals. Sophia suggested we head into the nearest town, over an hour's drive away, and gather supplies, maybe talk to locals about what might be skulking around at night. I reluctantly agreed. Anything to ease the gnawing tension in my stomach. We arrived at a small store near the park entrance where they sold camping gear, canned goods, and local crafts. While Sophia browsed, I struck up a conversation with the owner, a weathered woman named Marta. She wore a turquoise pendant that swung gently as she talked. When I mentioned weird footprints and nighttime chills, Marta's face grew grim. "You heard of La Bruja out here?" she asked. "They say a powerful witch once roamed the land. Some claim she still lingers, feeding on guilt and regret." My throat went dry. Marta went on to share how old curses might manifest as strange phenomena, cold mists in the desert, flickering lights on the horizon, voices that whisper your name. I thanked her, trying not to show how rattled I was. The entire drive back, Sophia tried to reassure me that it was just more folklore. But something about Marta's words stuck. That night, around dusk, Bo Delgado appeared at my campsite. "Heard you been spooked?" he said simply, leaning against his truck. I felt a jolt of both annoyance and relief that so many people seemed to know my business. Bo offered to camp out with me, maybe do a patrol of the area to see if we could spot what was causing all this. Desperate for clarity, I agreed, and Sophia decided to stick around too. The three of us built a small fire near the RV, telling ourselves it might deter any predators. The desert cooled quickly under the darkening sky. A waxing moon hung above the distant ridges, illuminating the rocks with pale light. We sat in folding chairs, our conversation hushed. Sometime around midnight, I felt that inexplicable chill again, as though cold air congealed at our feet. Sophia shivered, glancing at me. "You feel that, right?" she whispered. Even Bo's eyes widened. Before any of us could move, a soft mist curled across the ground. Not thick fog, exactly, but a wavering shimmer of cold moisture that defied the desert dryness. The hairs on my arms prickled. My heart thumped so loud I thought it would burst. Then I heard the hiss, a whispering sound like a breeze forcing itself between rocks. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure at the edge of the firelight, tall, limbs stretched unnaturally long, eyes glinting with a faint reflection of our flames. A strangled gasp escaped my throat. Sophia screamed, scrambling to her feet, and Bo grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the shape. Nothing. The figure vanished the moment the light hit that spot. But footprints remained in the dust, fresh impressions leading away into the darkness. We stood, pulses pounding as the chill receded. I wanted to call out, demand an explanation, but fear clamped my vocal cords. When I finally found my voice, I muttered, "What the hell was that?" Bo crouched, pressing his hand against the weird prints. They elongated, almost claw-like at the tips. He shook his head. "I've heard stories, never saw it myself. Some say it's a shapeshifter or a desert demon. Others claim it's the spirit of a bruja who cursed the land. Whatever it is, it's real enough." Sophia insisted we drive to the nearest motel for the night, but I resisted, a stubborn pride welling up in me. This was my home, however rough or haunted. Running from it wouldn't fix anything. So we stayed up till dawn, keeping the fire stoked, flashlights ready. The entity, or whatever it was, didn't show again, leaving us with only the memory of that chilling presence. The next day, Bo suggested a cleansing ritual he'd heard from local elders, a way to reclaim the land and break any ties a malevolent spirit might have to guilt or regret. I felt a surge of old oilfield shame, the sense that I'd polluted places like this with my work. Maybe the spirit saw me as a target, a man stained by exploitation of the earth. If it was feeding off my regret, perhaps I needed to confront it head-on. Sophia gathered sage from Marta's store, while Bo brought a small clay bowl and a handful of salt. That evening, we lit a fire again, chanting words Bo half-remembered from elders who believed in purifying the desert energies. It felt awkward, like we were playing at being shamans, but I threw my heart into it, apologizing, though I wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to the land itself, to all the damage I'd witnessed. I said I wanted to live with respect, that I wasn't here to harm. Sophia and Bo added their voices, the smoke of the sage swirling around us in thick plumes. Halfway through this improvised ritual, the temperature dropped abruptly, a wave of intense cold rolling over the campsite. The fire hissed, as if someone had doused it with invisible water. My breath came out in ragged puffs. In the darkness beyond our circle of light, the silhouette returned, looming taller than before. Its eyes caught the faint glow of the dying flames, reflecting an eerie, pale gleam. I forced myself not to look away. "I'm not running," I shouted, words echoing across the barren land. "This is my home now. I won't let you scare me off." My chest tightened, but I kept going, speaking from somewhere deep inside. "I regret what I've done. I'm sorry for the harm I've caused, but I'm not leaving." A strange moan emanated from the figure, as if the desert itself sighed in response. Then it lurched backward, receding into the gloom, its shape melting into the night. The wind picked up in a sudden gust, scattering the sage smoke in all directions. Then, just like that, the chill lifted. The fire flickered back to life, crackling with renewed energy. I felt my body sag with exhaustion, tears stinging my eyes. Sophia grabbed my arm, her face a mask of relief and shock. Bo nodded gravely, as if acknowledging we'd faced something powerful. Since that night, the desert has grown quieter. I won't say it's been peaceful exactly. This land can be harsh and mysterious in the best of times. But I haven't woken to any more chilling mists, and no new prints have materialized around the RV. Sometimes, on cloudless nights, I think I see a faint shimmer at the horizon, but it fades before I can be sure. Sophia still visits, though less worried now. Bo drops by occasionally, sharing coffee under the makeshift awning. We talk about how some places carry old scars, how some spirits might roam until they find either vengeance or release. I'm still here, living in the scorching heat, the dryness, the quiet that magnifies my thoughts. But the guilt doesn't weigh me down the same way it did before. In my own halting manner, I've tried to honor this land rather than exploit it, learning its rhythms and respecting its dangers. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how you survive in a place as unyielding as Big Bend, by meeting the desert on its own terms, acknowledging your failings, and standing your ground when the ghosts of your past come calling. Whenever I catch my reflection in the side of the RV, I see a man weathered by sun and wind, thinner than before, but steadier too. I'm not certain what I believe about curses or brujas or shape-shifting spirits, but I know I saw something that night, a force that tested my resolve. In facing it, I found a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. Each morning now I step outside, coffee steaming in the cool dawn air, and I watch the sunrise paint the desert in pink and gold. It's a harsh beauty, a constant reminder that the land holds ancient mysteries far beyond my understanding. I stand there quietly, breathing in the warmth, feeling alive in a way I never did back in the oil fields. Maybe I needed that confrontation with the unknown to finally let go of my old guilt. Maybe I had to see that even in the most desolate stretches, there's a kind of redemption waiting for those willing to face their own darkness. I'm staying, though the desert is no friend. It's a demanding teacher, a place that can kill you if you're careless, but it also offers a space to reconcile who you were with who you might become. And so, beneath the wide Texan sky, where even the wind carries secrets older than memory, I live on, forging a bond with this land I once helped desecrate. If any lingering spirit still watches me from the shadows, I hope it sees my determination, that I'm here to atone, not to flee. And if that's enough to keep the chilling mist at bay, then maybe I've earned my small corner of the desert after all. I never imagined I'd abandon the glow of computer screens and coding marathons for the misty woods of Washington. But sometimes life forces you down a path you least expect. For years, I was a software engineer in Seattle, juggling tight deadlines and bug fixes until my mind felt like it was perpetually on autopilot. My world shrank to the size of a laptop screen, a drab office cubicle, and the constant ping of incoming messages. One day, I realized I'd drifted far from the person I wanted to be. That epiphany struck late one night as I stared at code that refused to cooperate. My eyes ached from the fluorescent lights, and I found myself longing for silence. Real silence, not just the hush of a corporate office. I wanted to hear wind through trees, the soft rustling of forest creatures, maybe even the splash of a nearby creek. So I quit. I sold off most of my belongings, convinced my landlord to let me break the lease, and decided to move off-grid. It took me a few false starts before I landed on a tiny patch of land near the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southwestern Washington. A colleague had casually mentioned a glamping yurt for sale, an odd real estate find, and I jumped on it. It promised solitude, a chance to disconnect from ceaseless Wi-Fi signals and Slack alerts. That's how I ended up on a narrow gravel road flanked by towering evergreens, my car's suspension creaking with every rut. When the forest finally opened onto a small clearing, I saw the yurt, a circular structure with thick canvas walls and a conical roof, perched on a wooden platform. The previous owner left behind a small wood-burning stove, a simple bed, and a few shelves. A nearby shed housed a basic solar battery setup and a water filtration system pulling from a creek. It was more rustic than anything I'd ever known, yet I felt a strange euphoria. As I stepped out of my car, breathing in the crisp air, my ears rang with a kind of silence I'd forgotten existed. No car horns, no city buzz, just the soft hush of the forest. I took that as a sign I was doing the right thing, despite the flutter in my stomach telling me I might be nuts to leave a secure job. Over the next week, I settled into a routine. I woke with the sun, stoked the wood stove if the morning was chill, and ventured out to explore the trails. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest sprawled in every direction, a tapestry of moss-draped firs and ferns. I walked among them, letting my anxiety unravel with each step. Somewhere in my mind, I still heard the old ping of notifications, but it grew fainter as I immersed myself in the woodland's rhythms. That's where I first met Caleb Mercer, a local wilderness guide. I'd driven to a tiny general store in the nearest small town, just a couple of streets lined with old wooden buildings, to stock up on supplies. Inside, he noticed me picking out freeze-dried meals and offered a few recommendations for cooking with fresh local ingredients instead. "I'm Hannah," I introduced myself, a bit shy. "Caleb," he said, tipping his baseball cap. He was tall, with a sun-bronzed face and an easy manner. "I run guided hikes in the Gifford-Pinchot. You look new to the area." I explained my situation. City burnout, quest for solitude. He nodded sympathetically. "The forest is healing," he said, "but it can be tough, especially in winter. If you need help figuring out local trails or setting up your gear, let me know." I ended up taking his phone number. It felt odd. I just fled a life of near-constant connection, yet here I was grabbing a new contact. But something about his calm confidence reassured me. The store's owner, Eliza Stone, was another friendly face. She'd inherited the place from her parents and carried a mix of necessities: canned goods, lanterns, camping gear, and a corner of random tchotchkes. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. As I checked out, she asked where exactly I was staying. When I told her about the yurt, her expression turned cautious. "You're pretty far out there," she said, scanning my items. "Lots of folks find the quiet unnerving after dark. The forest can feel alive in ways city people aren't used to." I shrugged and gave a small laugh, trying to show I wasn't spooked. I came for the quiet. Eliza handed me my change, her tone earnest. "If you hear anything odd at night, don't ignore it. The Gifford-Pinchot is old land. Strange things happen in the deep woods." I brushed off the comment, chalking it up to local lore. In the days that followed, I focused on chores, learning how to maintain the solar battery, figuring out the best spots for collecting kindling, experimenting with a composting toilet that made me wrinkle my nose. Occasionally, I'd take my laptop, with a minimal data plan, outside to do some freelance coding, but mostly I let the forest hush cradle me. Then, one twilight, I heard a distant drumming. I was chopping vegetables for a stir-fry on my propane stove when a rhythmic thump, 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 thump echoed through the trees. It was faint, but unmistakable. I stepped onto the yurt's small deck, the sky awash in pink and gold, scanning the forest. The drumming didn't stop, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. Maybe a neighbor playing music, but there weren't many neighbors. It continued for maybe 5 minutes, then ceased abruptly. Shrugging, I assumed it was just campers partying in the woods. A couple of nights later, the drumming returned, only this time it came closer to my clearing. I felt a tingle of unease. It sounded almost ceremonial, steady and primal, stirring something ancient in me. Goosebumps prickled my arms. My rational side told me it was likely travelers or locals having a late-night jam session around a campfire. But the next morning, I found peculiar carvings etched into the bark of a large Douglas fir near my yurt. Strange symbols, overlapping circles, and jagged lines. Confusion welled up as I ran my fingers over the fresh cuts. Animals wouldn't do this, and I doubted it was some random hiker's idea of fun. It looked purposeful. A swirl of unease built in my chest. Eliza's words rang in my mind. Strange things happen in the deep woods. I tried to ignore the growing sense that something was off. The next evening, as I read by lantern light, my eyes strained from the dimness. Then the yurt's interior shifted in my peripheral vision. A swift, fleeting shadow along the canvas wall, like someone walking just outside. I leapt up, heart pounding. By the time I unzipped the door and aimed my flashlight, there was no one. The forest canopy rustled overhead, the night breeze carrying the scent of damp ferns. I circled the yurt, finding no footprints, no sign of an intruder. When I told Caleb about the drumming and the carvings during a chance run-in at the general store, he frowned. "I've heard rumors," he said, lowering his voice. "Some talk about local cults or hidden groups performing rituals, mostly urban legends. But be careful. It might be kids messing around. Kids who carve weird symbols and lurk at night." I asked doubtfully. He sighed. "I know how it sounds. If it gets worse, let me know. We can hike around your property, see if we find any clues." A few more nights passed quietly. No drumming, no shadowy figures. I relaxed a bit, telling myself I'd overreacted. The forest had its own rhythms, and I was simply not used to them. Then, just as I was drifting off one evening, a muffled thump rattled the yurt's walls. It was strong enough to make the metal support ring overhead quiver. My blood turned cold. Grabbing my flashlight, I tumbled outside. Nothing moved under the moonlit firs. Yet the tension in the air felt electric, as though the forest held its breath. I shone the flashlight around, calling out a shaky, "Hello?" The only reply was a sharp crack from somewhere deeper in the trees. I glimpsed a shape, slender, moving too quickly to register clearly, vanish behind a thick trunk. My stomach flipped. I inched toward the spot, shining the beam around. The underbrush rustled again. Then everything went still. Tense minutes passed before I retreated to the yurt, locking the door, though I doubted a simple canvas barrier offered any real protection if something wanted in. Sleep came in nervous fits. The next morning, I discovered the same carved symbols now etched on 2 more trees near the clearing. Fear sank like a stone in my gut. Someone, or something, was playing a game with me, marking my territory with cryptic patterns. I called Caleb, my voice shaking. He arrived that afternoon with a small pack, wearing hiking boots and a concerned expression. I led him around the property, pointing out the fresh carvings. He studied them, tracing the odd lines with a finger. "I don't recognize these from any native artwork I know," he murmured. "Might be some twisted interpretation of runes or something else." We scoured the area, following a faint track that led deeper into the woods. He tried to reassure me that we'd find evidence of kids or bored vandals. The trees thickened, moss dripping from branches. A haze of green light filtered down, making everything look dreamlike and ominous. After an hour, we stumbled on a small clearing. Dark shapes littered the ground. My heart slammed in my chest when I realized they were animal bones, arranged in a circle around a stump. Caleb grimaced. The bones were mostly small, rabbits maybe, but the pattern seemed deliberate, an unsettling echo of the carvings on my trees. A rotting stench hung in the still air. I covered my nose with my sleeve, nausea twisting my stomach. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't like this," he said quietly. "This is more than pranks." I wanted to turn and run back to the yurt, but we forced ourselves to look around a bit more. We found scraps of fabric snagged on thorny bushes, footprints that might have been from boots, though they were smudged. The entire clearing felt suffocating, as though we'd trespassed on sacred ground. The second we returned to the yurt, I collapsed onto my makeshift couch, trembling. Over mugs of tea, we discussed what to do next. The police were an option, but I doubted they'd put much effort into investigating weird carvings and animal bones on national forest land. Caleb offered to stay the night, but I felt embarrassed clinging to him. Still, fear won out over pride, and I accepted. We tried to stay vigilant, sipping tea well into the evening. The night sky was a tapestry of stars, the forest quiet except for an occasional owl's call. Caleb dozed off sometime after midnight, but I remained awake, heart hammering every time the wind creaked a branch. Around 2 a.m., the drumming started again, soft, rhythmic, but insistent. I shook Caleb awake. We grabbed flashlights and stepped onto the deck, scanning the trees. A dull glow flickered in the distance, like firelight dancing between trunks. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. Caleb whispered that we should approach carefully. Maybe we could catch whoever was doing this. We crept through the undergrowth, each step feeling louder than thunder in the hush. The drumming grew louder, echoing in my chest. Then we saw it. A small campfire in a clearing, flames licking upward. Around the fire stood 3 hooded figures, dark robes blending with the night. My blood ran cold. They chanted in low voices, the words twisted and guttural. I understood nothing, but the tone conveyed a sinister ritual. Fear paralyzed me. Caleb, too, looked stricken, though he tried to edge us closer to see more. Then, as if sensing our presence, one figure snapped its head toward us. Even in the dim glow, I saw pale features beneath the hood, eyes that glinted like an animal's caught in headlights. They hissed a word, and the chanting stopped. Time froze. The robed figures scattered, slipping into the darkness with impossible speed. Caleb shouted, switching on his flashlight. For a heartbeat, we glimpsed the remains of a small animal laid on a rock, blood staining the stone. My stomach lurched. By the time Caleb shone his beam around, the clearing was empty except for the dying flames. The drumming had vanished, replaced by my ragged breathing. We stumbled back to the yurt, adrenaline pounding. I locked the door, though it felt absurdly flimsy. Caleb murmured that we should call the authorities, but it was nearly 3 a.m., and cell service was spotty. "We'll go to the ranger station at dawn," he said, trying to calm me. Still shaking, I curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow. Dawn felt like it would never come. Sleep was impossible. Every small noise outside made me jolt upright. I half expected the robed figures to burst in, chanting in those guttural tones. But morning arrived without further incident, and we set off to the nearest ranger station, an hour's drive away. We found a ranger who listened patiently, but seemed skeptical when we described hooded figures and ritual carvings. He promised to alert local law enforcement and keep an eye out for unusual activity. I doubted it would lead anywhere, though he did take notes about the location of the clearing. With the authorities nominally informed, Caleb asked what I planned to do next. Part of me wanted to pack up and flee, find a safer corner of the world. But a stubborn spark in me refused to abandon the land I'd come to love. The forest had been a haven, a place where I hoped to heal. I told him I wasn't ready to run. That evening, I mustered my courage and called Eliza Stone, the store owner. She heard me out, then said something that struck me. Sometimes shining a light on the darkness is all you can do. If you cower, they gain power. She offered to lend me a couple of battery-powered floodlights to mount around the yurt. Caleb and I installed them, angling the beams to cover the perimeter of the clearing. We rigged up a motion sensor that would trigger an alarm inside if anything prowled within 30 feet. It wasn't foolproof, but it gave me a semblance of security. For the next few nights, nothing happened. No drumming, no carved trees, no robed figures. Anxiety still gnawed at me, though. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Meanwhile, I tried to recapture the peaceful routine I'd established, collecting firewood, walking along the creek, practicing mindfulness as I watched morning mist drift among the ferns. Then, in the middle of the fourth night, the alarm blared. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging. The floodlights switched on automatically, illuminating the clearing like a stage. Through a crack in the yurt's canvas door, I saw a shape dash behind a tree. Heart pounding, I fumbled for the flashlight and stepped outside, body tense. Within seconds, the clearing fell silent. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the bright circle of light. At the far edge, I spotted someone crouching, a hooded figure. They froze under the glare, then rose to stand, revealing a face half hidden in shadows. This time, they looked almost startled, like they hadn't expected the floodlights. We stared at each other across 20 yards of open ground. My hand shook on the flashlight. The figure hissed, then bolted for the tree line. I glimpsed scrawny limbs and tattered clothing beneath the cloak, not the confident stride from before. In a heartbeat, they vanished, leaving me trembling under the floodlight's harsh glow. That was the last direct encounter I had. I suspect they realized I wasn't helpless, and that the authorities were involved, even if only superficially. Over the following weeks, the carvings faded. No new ones appeared, and I stopped hearing the drumming. I let myself breathe again. Caleb remained a friend, visiting occasionally, offering to guide me on hikes that showcased the forest's beauty instead of its malevolence. Eliza teased me gently when I restocked supplies, saying I'd survived the Gifford Pinchot initiation. Maybe she was right. Sometimes the wilderness tests you. I never learned who those robed figures were, nor what dark rituals they practiced. Part of me suspects they moved on to a different part of the forest, or maybe they realized I wasn't the easy target they thought. Still, I stay cautious. Living off-grid means embracing solitude, but it also means facing the secrets the wild can harbor. Even though the fear remains a faint tremor in my chest, I refuse to let it drive me away. In the mornings, the sun filters through the thick canopy, turning dewdrops on fern fronds into sparkling jewels. In the evenings, the wood stove's warmth soothes me, the forest's hush broken only by owls and the gentle crackle of fire. Sometimes I wonder if those hooded strangers were part of something bigger, or if they were just a group of twisted thrill-seekers. I may never know, but in facing them, I found a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. Day by day, I reclaim the sense of awe I sought in leaving the city. The forest is alive, yes, with beauty, wonder, and, occasionally, darkness. But I'm here to embrace it all, one dawn and one dusk at a time. I haven't turned back to full-time coding, though I still do small freelance gigs. More often, I spend my hours marveling at the ancient firs that tower over me, the moss that clings to fallen logs, and the mushrooms that spring up after a rain. I'm learning that life can be both serene and unsettling, that sometimes you have to face the shadows to truly appreciate the light. If anything, the experience reminds me that we never truly escape the unknown. We carry our own ghosts and fears wherever we go. Yet, in this patch of Washington forest, I've learned to stand my ground. The nights may be long, and the shadows may flicker, But each morning the sun rises through the pines, reminding me why I'm here, to find a different kind of peace, one that acknowledges the darkness and doesn't back down. And for now, that's enough. It's funny how life shifts from a blur of adrenaline to the eerie stillness of a snowbound cabin. 1 year ago, I was all about extreme sports: rock climbing, whitewater kayaking, skydiving. I thrived on the rush of danger and the satisfying ache of a body pushed to its limits. Yet, somewhere along the way, the thrill-seeking blurred into burnout. My days got filled with sponsor obligations, social media posts, and a constant scramble to plan the next big stunt. I realized I was losing something essential, some sense of genuine wonder about the mountains I claimed to love. That's when I decided to go off-grid, high in the Rocky Mountains near Estes Park, Colorado. It wasn't a random choice. My grandparents used to have a small place in these mountains when I was a kid. I remembered summers exploring old logging roads and boulder fields, breathless under the wide sky. After my grandparents passed, the land sat dormant, ignored by other relatives who preferred modern comforts. I jumped at the chance to live here, telling myself it would reconnect me to the landscape. No camera crews, no sponsor deals, just me and the Rockies. The cabin itself was modest, built from logs my grandpa had cut decades ago. The walls were sturdy but worn, and the roof showed signs of leaks. I spent the first month patching holes, setting up a small array of solar panels, and stocking enough non-perishable food to get through winter storms. Neighbors were few and far between, mostly ranchers or weekend vacationers in nicer cabins. I saw them once in a while at the tiny grocery store down in Estes Park. None of them seemed too curious about the lone guy on the mountain. Fall passed swiftly in a blaze of golden aspens. Every morning I'd rise early, breathe in the thin air, and marvel at the towering peaks around me. It felt like my heart was finally slowing down from years of extreme sports chaos. I documented little moments in a private journal, like the time a herd of elk ambled through my yard, or when the first frost dusted the meadow behind the cabin. I didn't post any of it online, savoring that these experiences were mine alone. Winter arrived with a vengeance. The storms rolled off the Continental Divide, dumping snow that piled waist-high in drifts. I learned to keep paths clear and stock firewood meticulously. The cold at night dropped well below freezing, so I'd huddle by the wood stove, listening to logs pop and crackle. Sometimes the wind howled, rattling the shutters in a way that hinted at the mountain's raw power. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, I felt oddly content. I'd found the solitude I craved. It was around mid-January when strange things began. One moonlit night, I couldn't sleep, so I stood on my porch, hands shoved into my coat pockets, gazing at the sky. The moon glowed with a faint red tinge. An upcoming lunar eclipse had been mentioned on the radio, so I assumed this was just the start. Then I heard it, a low howl echoing across the peaks, not quite a wolf's call, but something deeper, more ragged. My breath caught. It sent a tremor through my chest, a reminder that nature up here could be uncanny. The following day, I hiked a short trail behind my cabin to gather downed branches for kindling. My boots sank into the crusty snow. The mountains loomed, silent except for the occasional rustle of wind. As I rounded a large boulder, I found footprints. Large, elongated, almost human-like, but spaced too far apart for a normal stride. They led in a meandering path between the trees before disappearing into deeper drifts. My pulse quickened. Could it be a bear that somehow left prints that looked vaguely human? I'd seen bear tracks before, and these seemed different. That night, I tried to brush it off as some trick of the snow. But as darkness settled, the wind rattled the windows, and I thought I heard scraping outside my cabin door. I stared at the shadow under the threshold, waiting for the door to bulge inward. Nothing happened. Finally, I convinced myself it was just snow shifting off the eaves. Still, sleep came in broken stretches, my mind replaying that eerie howl and the strange footprints. I woke before dawn, lured outside by a scarlet glow tinting the snow. The blood moon was nearly full now, staining the landscape in otherworldly hues. It was breathtaking in a haunting way. My chest tightened with some primal sense of unease. I thought about snapping a photo, but a deeper instinct said to keep my hands free. As I stepped around the cabin to gather more firewood, I spotted deep scratches on one of the logs near the back door. 3 parallel gouges, carved so deeply the bark curled outward. My heart hammered. There was no sign of an animal that could do this. Cougars or bears might scratch trees, but not in such a clean, precise manner. I radioed my friend Kelsey Young that afternoon. She was the only person I confided in regularly, a fellow climber who sometimes visited Estes Park for ice climbing excursions. "Hey," I said, voice tight, "I'm seeing weird stuff around my cabin. Tracks, scratches. It's freaking me out." Kelsey sounded concerned but logical. "Could be a mountain lion. They can leave freaky tracks if the snow melts around them. The scratches might be territorial markings. I'll swing by in a few days. I've got gear to pick up in Estes anyway. We can check it out together." I felt relief flood me. Maybe having a second pair of eyes would help me figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, I tried to stay calm, carrying my hunting rifle whenever I trekked through the property. I wasn't planning to shoot anything unless I had no choice, but holding the rifle gave me a semblance of confidence. Over the next few days, I discovered more footprints. Sometimes they'd circle my cabin. Other times they appeared at the edge of the meadow, peeking out from behind clumps of snow-laden pines. Each time, I tried to rationalize them. Snow melts, refreezes, creating odd shapes. But deep down, I felt a prickling fear that something was watching me. At night, I heard that low howl again, mingling with the wind's roar. Kelsey arrived late one afternoon, driving a beat-up SUV loaded with climbing ropes and crampons. She whistled at the snowdrifts towering along the driveway. "Heck of a winter," she said, stepping out, her breath steaming in the crisp air. When we got inside, I showed her photos I'd managed to snap of the footprints before they blew over. Her brow furrowed. "They do look strange," she admitted. "Could be a trick of the snow, or not." We bundled up and set out to explore. She led the way, scanning for tracks or signs of wildlife with the practiced eye of a climber who'd spent years in wilderness environments. We found faint prints behind the cabin, partly obliterated by wind-blown snow. Kelsey crouched, measuring one with her gloved hand. "It's definitely bigger than my boot," she muttered. "And look at the toe shapes. Almost elongated. I've never seen anything quite like it." A thread of unease wrapped around me. We pressed on, trudging through the powder toward a stand of pines. That's when Kelsey let out a low hiss, lifting her hand for me to stop. Ahead, partially hidden by a fallen trunk, were remnants of a carcass. A deer, torn open in a gruesome way, its guts scattered. Fresh blood stained the snow. Steam rose from the viscera, suggesting it wasn't killed long ago. I gagged, reflexively covering my mouth. Kelsey's face went pale. A thick set of footprints trailed away from the carcass, leading deeper into the trees. Fear pinched at my stomach. Kelsey nudged me, her voice low. "We should head back. This is fresh. Whatever did this might still be around." We backed away, rifles ready, senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. The air felt charged, like static before a storm. By the time we made it back to the cabin, dusk was settling in, painting the peaks with fiery orange. We locked the door behind us and lit lanterns. The wind picked up, shrieking against the walls, a dire soundtrack to our fraying nerves. "I've dealt with predators before," Kelsey said as we brewed coffee on my propane stove, "but this doesn't feel normal." She hesitated, fiddling with the tin coffee cup. "Locals sometimes whisper about weird things in the Rockies, skewed versions of skinwalkers, Wendigo tales, nothing concrete, but enough to make you wonder." She tried to laugh it off, but I saw the fear flicker in her eyes. We decided we'd keep a vigil that night. Rifles and flashlights close at hand. The temperature plummeted, so we stoked the wood stove, huddling in front of it. Outside, the blood moon rose higher, reddening the sky. Every so often, I'd peek through the window, scanning the yard. The shadows stretched long, and the snow glowed under the moon's eerie tint. Around midnight, the wind lulled, plunging everything into unsettling silence. Then came the howl, closer than ever, a bone-chilling wail that vibrated the cabin's glass. Kelsey and I locked eyes. I nodded, heart thundering. We killed the lantern, letting moonlight seep through the windows. Slowly, we cracked the door, rifles raised. The cold stung my face as I crept onto the porch, Kelsey at my side. The howl sounded again, from somewhere to our left. The hair on my arms rose. Something moved near the tree line. A tall, hunched shape with eyes reflecting dull red under the lunar glow. My breath caught. It looked almost human in outline, but impossibly gaunt and elongated, limbs twisted at odd angles. It stared at us, letting out a guttural snarl that made my stomach flip. We both froze. I lifted my rifle, finger trembling on the trigger. A moment of indecision hung in the frigid air. Shoot or warn it off? As if sensing my hesitation, the creature sprang forward in a blur of movement, crossing several yards of snow in seconds. Kelsey fired a shot, the crack echoing between peaks. Snow exploded where the bullet struck, missing the shape by inches. It veered away, letting out a hideous shriek that jolted me to my core. We scrambled back inside, slamming the door, hearts pounding. Adrenaline buzzed in my veins. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of the creature darting behind a snowbank, unnaturally fast. Then it vanished into the darkness. We secured the windows, each breath rattling in my chest. For the rest of the night, we huddled by the stove, rifles in hand, every creak of timber setting our nerves on edge. The howling didn't return, but we felt the creature's presence lurking just beyond the light, as though it tasted our fear. At dawn, we ventured outside, muscles stiff from tension. Daylight revealed the tracks around the cabin, deep, erratic prints leading toward the woods. I shuddered at the memory of its elongated limbs and the stench of primal aggression. Kelsey pressed a hand to my shoulder. "We can pack up, drive down to Estes. Tell the ranger station we've got a dangerous predator." But I shook my head, stubborn as always. This land was my grandparents' legacy, and I refused to be driven away by something I couldn't understand. Over the next day, we reinforced the cabin, adding extra wooden planks to the windows, setting up a perimeter of motion sensor lights I'd salvaged from my old sponsor gear. We prepared for another confrontation. The blood moon reached its peak that night, supposedly the height of the eclipse. A part of me hoped it was just an old superstition, that once the moon cycle passed, the creature would vanish. Another part of me dreaded the worst. Sure enough, after dark, we heard it again, the guttural moan echoing through the pines. The motion lights around the cabin flicked on one by one, as if something circled our perimeter. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles ached. Kelsey peered through a gap in the barricaded window, jaw set. Suddenly, the lights in the back blinked off. My stomach lurched. Did the creature destroy them? We hurried to the back room, rifles at the ready. The door rattled with a force that made the hinges squeal. Kelsey leveled her gun, eyes wide. "Stay back!" she shouted. The rattling intensified. Splinters flew as the door frame began to crack. I swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking. Just before the door gave way, the motion lights flickered on again, illuminating the shape outside. Through a hastily nailed wooden slat, I saw its twisted limbs bathed in harsh electric glare. It hissed, recoiling as if burned. Then came Kelsey's shot, deafening in the small space. The door rattled once more, and the creature let out a guttural wail, retreating into the shadows. For a moment, the night fell silent. Cautiously, we stepped onto the porch. The cold, biting. Blood smeared the broken frame, a dark stain against the pine boards. The creature must have been hit or grazed by Kelsey's bullet. We didn't dare follow its trail far into the woods. Instead, we waited for dawn, rifles ready, hearts in our throats. By sunrise, there was no further sign of it, except for the crimson spots staining the snow along the tree line. We wondered if it would heal or if we'd find a carcass, but the tracks zigzagged into dense forest, and we weren't about to chase it. After a long discussion, Kelsey and I decided to keep watch for a couple more nights, waiting to see if it returned. It never did. As the blood moon waned, so did the eerie howling. The footprints, once so frequent around the cabin, stopped appearing. The sense of oppression in the air lifted, replaced by the ordinary chill of winter. In the weeks that followed, we gradually lowered our guard. Kelsey stayed a while, helping me repair the battered door and reinforce the cabin. We reported a possible dangerous predator to local rangers, describing it as a large, unidentified animal. They chalked it up to a wounded mountain lion or bear, but we knew that explanation didn't quite fit. Neither of us insisted, though. Who would believe us if we described a twisted, humanoid creature stalking under a blood moon? Eventually, Kelsey headed home, leaving me alone again with the mountains. I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering dread. The Rockies looked as majestic as ever, the snows glistening under bright sunlight. But late at night, sometimes I imagine I hear a faint howl carried on the wind. When I check outside, there's nothing, just an expanse of silent snowdrifts and starlit peaks. Maybe it's my memory playing tricks, or maybe the creature still roams, wounded but alive in the deep wilderness. Despite everything, I've chosen to stay. This land has become part of me, and I refuse to surrender it to any nightmare. I keep my rifle clean and my windows bolted, especially on clear nights when the moonlight seems a little too red. The adrenaline junkie in me almost finds a thrill in knowing the mountains hold secrets we can't explain. But a wiser part of me respects that some things out here defy our usual labels of predator or prey. I'm not just an adventurer in these peaks. I'm a guest in a domain far older and wilder than I ever imagined. So I go on with my days, chopping wood, mending gear, scribbling in my journal. Winter's starting to relent, and soon the thaw will bring muddy paths and green shoots. I've learned that true challenge isn't always about scaling a cliff or braving rapids. It can be about facing something you can't pin down, something that shakes your certainty. In that confrontation, I found a quiet courage, a willingness to stay where I belong, come what may. There's a comfort in knowing the Rockies haven't changed. They remain vast, mysterious, beautiful, and sometimes deadly. I stand on my porch most mornings, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in pink and gold, and I feel a surge of awe. This is why I came, to witness something bigger than my own ambitions. The memory of that blood moon creature lingers in the back of my mind, reminding me that the wild holds both terror and wonder. And for me, that's reason enough to remain, rooted in these mountains, unafraid of the darkness that sometimes prowls under the crimson moon. I never planned to find myself amid the red-brown desert plains of northern New Mexico, but sometimes life nudges you to places you'd never dreamt of. After 15 years teaching in a bustling urban school, I felt worn thin, my days a swirl of lesson plans, after-school meetings, and administrative checklists. My patience was frayed, and I realized I was doing my students no favors by pushing forward without ever pausing to breathe. So I took a sabbatical, longing for a slower, more meaningful existence where I could reconnect with nature and, if possible, with myself. That's how I ended up near Taos, standing in front of an Earthship-style home made of recycled tires, adobe, and glass bottles. I'd seen photos of these eco-friendly wonders, half spaceship, half desert hobbit house, and something in me lit up. I thought, why not? So I sublet my apartment in the city, packed my car with basic belongings, and drove across sun-scorched highways until the rolling hills turned to mesas, and the air smelled of sagebrush and infinite possibility. My Earthship was perched on a gentle slope, facing the Taos Plateau that stretched for miles in every direction. Its southwestern wall was angled to catch the sun, helping heat the interior. Rows of glass bottles embedded in mud walls let in soft light, creating rainbow patterns across the living space. Inside, I had a small kitchen, a sleeping loft, and a makeshift desk overlooking the desert through wide windows. A gutter system collected rare rainfall into a holding tank for showers and dishwashing. The previous owner assured me it functioned well most months, provided I stayed mindful of water usage. I arrived at dusk. The desert sky blazed pink, then purple, then deepened into a vault of stars so vivid I felt dizzy looking up. The silence was immense, a hush broken only by a faint breeze ruffling the scrub. I breathed in the scent of sage, exhaling the tension of city life. This was what I needed. No streetlights, no constant hum of traffic, just the vast open desert and me. Over the first week, I settled into a gentle rhythm, waking at sunrise, making coffee with my limited water supply, journaling about whatever feelings or insights bubbled up. I'd walk the property in the morning's coolness, letting the sun warm my skin. By midday, the heat felt relentless, so I'd retreat inside, reading or planning small projects, like improving my modest solar array. Toward evening, I'd explore local galleries or visit the nearby town for supplies. The people of Taos were friendly in a quiet way, acknowledging me with a nod and offering tips on desert living. I'd learned to expect certain inconveniences. Sand seemed to invade every corner of the Earthship. The wind could be fierce, and water was a precious commodity. But I relished the challenge, feeling a sense of calm suffusing my days. My only real complaint was a recurring feeling that the land itself was watching me, like an ancient presence silently observing. I chalked it up to my imagination, or perhaps the desert's uncanny ability to make a person feel both insignificant and profoundly alive. Then the strange light started. It happened on my 9th night, well after midnight. I'd opened the front door to get a breath of cool air before bed, only to see faint orbs dancing across the distant foothills, pinpricks of pale blue and yellow, moving in slow arcs. I stared in fascination, heart thumping. Were they headlights? But there was no road where they drifted, just rocky terrain. I watched for several minutes until they winked out. My pulse raced with the thrill of the unknown. A few days later, I mentioned the lights to Diego Cruz, a local artisan I'd befriended. We'd met in a small shop where he sold handcrafted ceramic bowls and pendants. As soon as I described the phenomenon, he gave a pensive nod. Some folks call them ghost lights, he said. Others say they're spirits watching the land. Old watchers from before the Spanish came. Could also be just desert mirages. Hard to say. We sipped hibiscus tea, while Diego explained that the desert around Taos brims with legends. Some are of friendly spirits, others of darker entities, shapeshifters or brujas, witches who command the wind and shadows. I felt a nervous flutter. I'd heard similar tales growing up in a Chicano family, but they'd always seemed distant, more cautionary stories than reality. Now, in the starkness of the desert, they felt closer, as if the boundary between myth and truth had thinned. I tried to put the lights out of my mind, yet at night, each time I stepped onto the Earthship's little porch, I half expected to see them flickering in the distance. The desert wind would sigh across the sagebrush, and my skin prickled with a sense of being watched. It was both unsettling and oddly exhilarating. A week later, my friend Emily Walker arrived from Santa Fe. She and I shared a bond from our college days, when we'd dreamt of exploring the world, living in offbeat places. She was the first visitor to see my Earthship in person. The moment she stepped from her car, she let out a whoop of delight. "Sophia, this place is unreal," she exclaimed, eyes shining as she toured the domed interior and admired the bottle-glass walls. We spent the day catching up, cooking a simple meal with produce from a local farmer's market, and then sat outside on a makeshift bench to watch the sunset. As dusk deepened, I found myself glancing at the far hills, silently wondering if the lights would appear again. Sure enough, not long after the last sliver of sun vanished, pale orbs flickered into view. Emily spotted them immediately. Her curiosity piqued. "Are those car headlights?" she asked, squinting. I shook my head. "I don't think so. There's no road out there, at least not one I know of." Together, we watched the lights drift. Emily muttered possibilities. Maybe off-road vehicles, drones, or a weather phenomenon. Then a gust of wind blew through, kicking up dust. The lights vanished like a switch flipped. Emily looked at me, eyebrows raised. "That's weird." I explained about the local lore. She laughed, claiming she was too rational for ghost lights. Yet I sensed she, too, felt the hair-raising quality of the moment. The desert night can make skeptics reconsider, especially when confronted with unexplained glimmers in the dark. The next day, we decided to drive into Taos for an art walk and to browse the local shops. We found Diego tending his ceramics booth in a small plaza. Emily mentioned the lights to him, and he gave us both a thoughtful look. "Just be cautious," he said. "Sometimes curiosity draws attention from things you might not want to meet." He hesitated, then added, "And if you ever hear chanting at night, don't go looking for it." His words lingered with me for the rest of the afternoon. Why mention chanting specifically? Over dinner, Emily tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake a sense of looming mystery. That night, we returned to the Earthship, flush with wine and laughter, the desert sky brilliant with stars. As we settled in, the wind began to moan, swirling dust against the windows. A strange tension filled the air, as if the land itself was bracing for something. Emily yawned. Heading to the small guest nook I'd prepared for her, I lay on my bed, eyes drifting shut despite the wind's keening. At some point, I woke to a faint noise, a low, repetitive murmur. My heart jumped. Peering at the clock, I saw it was nearly 3 a.m. The sound continued, drifting through the earthen walls. Slowly, quietly, I got up, slipped on my shoes, and tiptoed out the door. Outside, a cold gust tugged at my hair. The moon was hidden by clouds, casting the desert in near-total darkness. Yet I heard the murmur clearly, a chant-like rhythm, coming from somewhere beyond my property, the same direction as the dancing lights. My first thought was to wake Emily, but a stubborn impulse pushed me forward alone. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured away from the Earthship, footsteps crunching on gravel. The chanting grew louder, though still muffled by the wind. My flashlight beam probed the night, revealing only clusters of sagebrush and scattered rocks. Sweat prickled at my temples despite the chill. 100 yards from the house, I paused, second-guessing my bravery. Diego's warning echoed. If you ever hear chanting at night, don't go looking for it. A surge of fear constricted my chest. At that moment, the chanting cut off, replaced by a deep hush. My flashlight flickered as if the battery faltered. I tapped it, heart pounding. The beam steadied, and for an instant, I caught the outline of something moving, hunched low, about 50 feet away. My stomach lurched. It disappeared behind a rise in the land. I backed away, pulse hammering. The wind kicked up, stirring dust into my eyes. Retreating to the Earthship, I locked the door, hands shaking. Emily emerged from her nook, alarmed by my wide-eyed expression. I told her what happened, how I heard chanting, saw a figure. She tried to sound calm, but her face showed concern. "Let's just stay inside," she whispered, scanning the windows. We spent the rest of the night on edge, listening to the winds howl. Once, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when we mustered the courage to check, there was nothing. Dawn crept in, gray light revealing the desert in all its barren beauty. The tension felt like it had dissolved with the rising sun, leaving only a dull throb of unease in my chest. That afternoon, Emily, visibly unnerved, decided it was time to head back to Santa Fe. "I love your place," she said, "but I'm not cut out for these midnight mysteries." I hugged her, pretending I wasn't rattled, too. After her car disappeared down the dusty road, I felt a pang of loneliness. The quiet of the desert now seemed less like solace and more like an open stage for the unknown. I reached out to Diego again, explaining what I'd experienced. He listened solemnly, then invited me to meet him at a local coffee shop. Over steaming cups of biscochitos and coffee, he confessed that he too had witnessed strange sightings near the mesa, a silhouette that seemed to vanish into thin air, chanting that rode the wind in the dead of night. Some in his family spoke of an ancient shapeshifter, or a spirit that guarded sacred desert spaces, testing those who dared dwell alone in its domain. He said it fed on fear, that if someone carried guilt or sorrow, it could prey on that vulnerability. I thought of my burnt-out state, the emotional baggage I'd brought here. Perhaps this desert spirit sensed my frailty. My mouth felt dry as I asked, "So, what do I do? Leave?" Part of me refused to consider giving up this sabbatical. Another part trembled at the idea of facing whatever roamed the night. Diego suggested a cleansing ritual. Some folks have done it to ask for protection from the land's ancient spirits. You offer respect, sage, prayers, maybe a personal token. It won't guarantee you'll never see anything odd, but it shows humility. That evening, I gathered sage, a small silver pendant that was dear to me, and a bit of cornmeal, an offering I'd read about in stories of southwestern traditions. I walked a short distance behind my Earthship, heart thudding as sunset tinged the sky orange. Finding a little hollow by a scattering of rocks, I knelt. The desert wind brushed against my cheeks, cool and watchful. I lit the sage bundle, letting the fragrant smoke swirl around. In a quiet voice, I spoke in Spanish and English, asking the land for peace, for safe passage through its mysteries, for forgiveness if I'd been disrespectful. I laid the pendant and cornmeal on a flat stone, hoping this gesture might carry weight in a realm beyond my understanding. For several minutes, the world held still. Then the wind shifted, tugging my hair and scattering sage embers into the fading light. I felt a hush settle in my chest, a release of tension. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but I sensed acceptance, like the desert had listened. That night, I stood by the door of the Earthship, gazing at the star-soaked sky. No chanting drifted on the breeze. The wind blew softly, but it no longer howled. A sigh of relief escaped me as I latched the door and climbed into bed, exhaustion washing over me. When I closed my eyes, I dreamed of swirling dunes and ancient shapes dancing across a firelit mesa, haunting yet not hostile, as if performing a sacred rite that I wasn't meant to fear. The days that followed brought a welcome calm. The nighttime lights on the distant hills still flickered occasionally, but they seemed to keep their distance. I heard no more chanting, found no mysterious footprints outside. The desert felt gentler, as though we'd reached a quiet understanding. I spent my mornings in meditation, letting gratitude bloom for the chance to rest in such a remarkable place. One afternoon, Emily called, half joking that she hoped I hadn't been abducted by ghosts. I assured her I was fine, though a wry laugh caught in my throat. I didn't tell her about the ritual. I wasn't sure she'd believe me, or maybe I just wanted to keep that moment private, between me and the desert. Diego stopped by with fresh bread once or twice, and we talked about his ceramic projects, never delving too deeply into paranormal topics. It was enough to know we'd shared an unspoken bond of experiences beyond logic. Sometimes, at night, I still feel the flutter of nerves, recalling that chanting and the shadow I glimpsed. But then I look at the sky, the brilliant swath of the Milky Way arcing overhead, and I think of how ancient and vast this land is. Perhaps there are forces here older than human memory, weaving through the sage and rock, watching with inscrutable patience. I've decided that's part of the desert's magic, and I accept it, even if I can't fully explain it. The sabbatical continues. I've found a serenity I lacked in the city, though it's laced with an awareness that I'm a guest in a realm where nature's mysteries still roam free. Most days, I rise at dawn to write or paint the mesa in soft watercolors. In the afternoons, I tinker with the Earthship's systems, grateful for the sense of self-reliance. At dusk, I sometimes watch the horizon for those dancing lights. When they appear, I nod respectfully, as if greeting old acquaintances. I won't pretend the desert's silence is always comforting. There are moments when the wind sighs against the windows, and a shiver creeps up my spine, memories of that chanting stirring in me. But I feel less fear now, and more awe. It's like I've glimpsed another layer of reality, one where old spirits roam, testing the hearts of those who dare dwell in solitude. If that's true, maybe I passed their test by offering my humility. Or maybe they simply moved on to another mesa, another traveler. For now, I remain in my Earthship, forging a fragile but real bond with the desert. In this sparse landscape, I've discovered depths in myself I'd long neglected. Resilience, reverence, the capacity for wonder. Each sunrise feels like a quiet blessing, each sunset a reminder that darkness can be both beautiful and terrifying. I'm learning to live in that balance, and in doing so, I find a gentle kind of peace. Whenever my sabbatical ends, I don't know if I'll return to teaching in a city or find a new path entirely. But I do know the desert has changed me. It's whispered secrets in the wind, shown me flickers of an ancient realm just beyond sight. I've learned not to turn away from the unknown, but to face it, humbly, with my heart open. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all, one no classroom or textbook could ever teach me. I never imagined I'd wind up in the Appalachian foothills near Harper's Ferry, but sometimes your life hits a wall and you realize you need a place to breathe. I'd spent years as a social worker in Baltimore, juggling an endless cycle of crises, broken systems, and heartbreaking stories. I cared deeply for my clients, but the city's noise and the stress wore down my spirit. Each day, I felt a little more hollow, like I was running on fumes. Eventually, I took a leap. I rented a small patch of land in West Virginia, just a few miles outside Harper's Ferry, and decided to try living off-grid. The property itself wasn't grand, just a rickety cabin tucked away in the wooded hills overlooking a bend of the Potomac River. It belonged to a distant relative who'd passed, and I'd inherited a chance to live there rent-free if I maintained it. The cabin had a sagging roof, a crude setup for electricity through solar panels, and a well in the yard that provided water, assuming I could keep the pump running. When I first arrived in late summer, the forest felt alive with cicadas and birds, and a soft breeze carried the scent of damp earth. I stood on the porch, letting the hushed greenery wrap around me like a comforting blanket. For the first time in ages, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. I wasn't completely alone. A few miles downstream lived Loretta Bell, an elderly neighbor who'd spent her whole life in these hills. She was tough as nails, a widow with keen eyes and a wiry frame that belied her age. She visited one afternoon, arriving unannounced in an ancient pickup truck, bearing a basket of tomatoes and beans. She gave my rundown cabin a critical once-over and said, "Folks around here mind their own, but you best keep your wits about you after sundown. The woods carry old echoes." I wasn't sure what she meant, but I sensed she was protective, in her own no-nonsense way. The first few weeks I worked on making the cabin livable. The porch wobbled underfoot, so I replaced a few rotten boards. The single wood stove leaked smoke, which I remedied by scrounging a new pipe from a salvage yard. Every chore felt purposeful, a far cry from the endless drudgery of city traffic and cramped apartments. I learned how to harvest rainwater in barrels, handy for washing clothes and dishes so I didn't overtax the well. I mapped out a small garden patch near the tree line, hoping to grow vegetables before the weather cooled. The labor left me exhausted but fulfilled. At night, I'd fall asleep to the lull of crickets, occasionally waking in the dead of night with a start, forgetting where I was. I did have a friend in the area, Miguel Hansen, a kayak tour guide I'd met at a social function back in Baltimore. When I told him I was moving to Harper's Ferry, he was thrilled, saying he sometimes led kayak trips down the Potomac and Shenandoah. He popped by whenever he had a break, bringing tales of rowdy tourists who capsized canoes or misread rapids. His visits kept me from feeling too isolated, and he was also a good sounding board whenever the cabin repairs got overwhelming. The difficulties of off-grid living hit me soon enough. Maintaining the well pump proved tricky. It sputtered unpredictably, leaving me to haul water by hand some mornings. My small solar array struggled during overcast stretches, so I rationed electricity. The old cabin's insulation was laughable, letting drafts sneak in. Still, I held on to the hope that, come fall, I'd be prepared enough to handle the chill. The quiet gave me room to breathe, to think, to process the emotional toll my former job had taken. Yet, even in that tranquil setting, I couldn't ignore a subtle disquiet that settled in at dusk. A few times I heard distant singing, soft, melodic, like a lullaby carried on the breeze. I'd step onto the porch, scanning the woods, but the sound always faded, replaced by the whisper of leaves in the wind. One evening, I found fresh footprints in the mud near my yard's edge. They looked smaller than an adult's, bare feet pressed into the damp soil. Confused, I checked around, half expecting to find a lost child, but there was only the sway of branches. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a stray camper from the river. The next day, the footprints had washed away in a light rain. Loretta, during one of her visits, noticed my unease. I mentioned the singing, the footprints, the uneasy feeling. She tilted her head, lips pursed. "The Potomac's seen wars, drownings, heartbreak," she said quietly. "Harper's Ferry has a lot of history, some of it violent. Soldiers died in these hollows. Families got ripped apart by floods and battles. Sometimes, them echoes linger." The way she said it made goosebumps prickle my arms. I asked if she believed in ghosts. She shrugged. "I believe in what I've seen, and I've seen enough to know the past doesn't always rest." Miguel was more skeptical. When I told him about the singing, he insisted it was probably echoes from the river, Maybe late-night boaters or kids messing around. He offered to stay over one weekend to see if he could hear it too. That weekend, we grilled sausages over a small fire pit outside the cabin, swapping stories under a starlit sky. The evening passed pleasantly, without a hint of eerie lullabies. I started doubting my own senses. Maybe I was just unraveling from the stress of city life. But then, a few days later, I woke around midnight with a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. My small lantern flickered near the bed, casting dancing shadows on the rough log walls. Outside, the wind had died, leaving the night unnaturally still. Straining my ears, I heard a faint noise, like humming. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed a flashlight. Slowly, I crept to the door and eased it open. The soft hum wove through the dark, floating from somewhere near the tree line. It sounded like a lullaby, simple and sad, stirring a deep ache in my chest that I couldn't place. I forced myself off the porch and moved cautiously through the yard, flashlight beam slicing the darkness. The humming drifted ahead, just out of reach, and I followed, boots scuffing on damp leaves. After maybe 20 yards, the hum stopped. My flashlight revealed only trees and tangled undergrowth. My pulse thudded. I nearly called out, but something in my gut warned me to stay silent. Then, a soft rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling, but I saw only the thick trunk of an oak. The undergrowth parted slightly, as though a figure slipped away. My skin crawled. Enough. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me, breath ragged. Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night perched by the window, eyes darting at every shift of shadow. Morning brought a certain sanity, the bright sun melting away the night's dread. But the memory lingered. Loretta's words replayed in my mind, echoes of old sorrow. I decided to do some research about the region's history. In town, there was a small museum dedicated to the Civil War era and the battles fought around Harper's Ferry. I spent hours combing through dusty documents and old photographs, hoping to find an explanation for lullabies in the night. A kind-faced curator listened to my questions with a hint of amusement, but offered no concrete leads, just a general statement that many families had been displaced or lost around these parts, especially during the war and subsequent floods. That same afternoon, I ran into Miguel, who was leading a group of tourists on a kayaking trip. He waved me over, noticing my anxious demeanor, and after his tour ended, we grabbed coffee in a small cafe. He suggested I gather actual evidence, maybe set up a recorder or something if the singing returned. I nodded, though part of me felt uneasy about capturing a lullaby that might belong to a restless spirit. Still, I was desperate to prove I wasn't losing my mind. That very night, I positioned my phone on a windowsill, set to record audio. I kept a small notepad handy in case I heard anything. The hours drifted by, and I dozed off in a creaky armchair. Around 2 a.m., I woke with a start. The cabin was eerily quiet. No singing, no wind. The phone's battery was half drained, its screen dark. I sighed, disheartened, and trudged to bed. Maybe it was over. But come morning, curiosity nagged me. I checked the audio file. For the first hour or two, there was nothing but my own shuffling and the pop of the wood stove. Then, faintly, the recorder picked up a soft humming around 1:47 a.m. It lasted 20 seconds. Distant, but distinct. My blood went cold listening to it. I played the snippet back multiple times. A lullaby, wordless, drifting on the still air. Could it be a neighbor? Some hiker? The nearest house was Loretta's, miles away, and she sure didn't strike me as someone who hummed lullabies in the dead of night. I wanted to show Miguel, but I also dreaded confirming something beyond logic. In a moment of impulsive fear, I deleted the file. Immediately, regret stabbed at me. That evidence was gone. Was that my only chance to prove it was real? Shaking my head, I decided I needed answers from someone who'd seen more than I had. Loretta came to mind. She might know more local legends, or at least steer me in the right direction. I drove to her place the next day, winding along a dirt road that followed the river's curve. Her small farmhouse looked weather-beaten yet sturdy, surrounded by a few goats and chickens. Loretta greeted me with a knowing look as if she'd expected me. I sat at her kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea while mustering the courage to ask about ghosts or lullabies. Eventually, I just blurted, "Have you ever heard singing at night around here?" She took a long moment before replying. "I've heard plenty of odd things in my time. Some folks talk about a child who drowned in the river decades back, forever searching for her family. Others speak of a Civil War widow who lost a baby during the fighting. I can't say which story is real or if any of them are. But the songs come and go, especially near the water." She paused, eyes distant. "If you ever see a small figure in white, turn away. Don't follow it." A shiver crawled along my spine. "So you think these are spirits?" Loretta shrugged. "Call them what you like. The land remembers. Not everyone rests easy." That night, I found myself pacing, anticipating the lullaby. Around midnight, I heard the faintest strain of humming. Fear and fascination warred inside me. Instead of stepping outside, I cracked a window, letting the sound drift in. The melody clutched at something deep in my chest, a sorrowful yearning that made my eyes sting. It felt familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it would drown out the singing. Suddenly, a soft knock on my door. My blood iced. Who would knock at this hour? Voice shaking, I called, "Who's there?" No answer. The knock came again, gentle but insistent. Summoning courage, I unlatched the door and opened it a crack. The yard lay in moonlit shadows, empty except for a wisp of fog curling along the ground. The lullaby stopped. Then I saw it. A pale figure crouched by the corner of the cabin, like a small child in white. I stifled a gasp, stepping back. The figure stood, no taller than my waist, turning toward me. I couldn't make out features, only a vague shape. Every hair on my neck stood on end. The figure raised one hand, maybe beckoning. My pulse hammered. I remembered Loretta's warning, "Don't follow." I slammed the door, locking it. For a few seconds the lullaby resumed, muffled by the wooden walls, then faded into silence. I huddled by the door, breath ragged, tears burning my eyes. Fear coiled in my gut, but there was also a crushing sadness. Whoever or whatever this spirit was, it seemed bound to these hills, replaying an endless heartbreak. 2 days passed without further incident. I wrestled with whether to call Miguel. He had a more logical mind, but I feared he'd dismiss me or, worse, confirm I was dealing with something unearthly. On the 3rd day, I found the cabin door smeared with mud, small handprints pressed against the wood, as though a child had placed them there. My stomach churned. That sealed it. I needed help. Miguel arrived that afternoon, eyes flicking warily to the muddy prints. I recounted the entire story, from the footprints in the yard to the hush of lullabies at midnight and the pale figure's appearance. To my relief, he believed me, or at least he believed I believed it. We decided to spend one final night on high alert, cameras and audio recorders set up. If something showed, we'd try to appease it or find a rational explanation. Near midnight, we waited in the cabin, nerves taut. The wind rattled the windows, and the battered shutters clicked against the logs. The hours dragged on. Just when we thought maybe we'd have a quiet night, a low hum drifted from outside. My heart kicked up. Miguel's eyes widened. He hit record on his phone. The lullaby swelled, heartbreakingly clear, then ebbed. We stepped onto the porch, rifles in hand, not to shoot, but to feel less helpless. The yard lay in silver moonlight. Then we saw the small figure again, standing by the edge of the trees. The hood of a white gown or dress half covered its head. It raised an arm, gesturing. A child's voice, or something akin to it, murmured through the hush. My knees threatened to buckle. For a moment, Miguel froze. Then he forced himself to speak gently. "We don't mean any harm." The figure seemed to flicker, as if made of moonlight itself. A ripple of sorrow emanated from it, almost tangible, like a wave of despair. I felt a tear slip down my cheeks unbidden. The lullaby resumed, so soft I barely heard it. Every instinct screamed to run, yet I sensed no malice, only an endless mourning. Miguel and I lowered our rifles, unsure what else to do. In the next heartbeat, the figure dissolved into the shadows beneath the pines. The singing faded with it, leaving the yard silent except for our shaky breathing. We didn't move for what felt like ages. Finally, Miguel let out a breath. "Jamie," he said, voice quavering. I don't know what that was. Dawn brought an odd calm. We checked the camera footage. We'd captured faint orbs of light, an indistinct shape near the tree line, and audio of the lullaby. It was enough to confirm we hadn't imagined it. Neither of us had a plan to exorcise a spirit or anything like that. We decided to follow Loretta's wisdom. Respect the old echoes. Don't provoke them. Maybe it just needed acknowledgement. I gathered a few wildflowers and placed them near the spot we'd seen the figure, whispering a quiet message of peace. I didn't know if it would help, but it felt right. Over the next weeks, the lullabies grew less frequent, until they faded altogether. The sense of weight in the air lightened, like whatever haunted the night had found some small solace. Miguel had to get back to his tours, but he stayed in touch, worried about me. I assured him I'd be careful. Some nights, I still wake around midnight, expecting to hear that soft singing or see muddy footprints by the door. But the cabin rests quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. The old sadness remains, but it's gentler, no longer pressing against my mind. I can't explain it fully. Maybe an ancient sorrow was recognized, a lost spirit was heard, or maybe the land just decided I wasn't a threat anymore. I'm settling in for winter now, chopping wood, canning what I can from my little garden. Living off-grid is still tough, but I feel more at peace than I ever did in the city. The work is honest, the quiet is healing, and I've made my peace with the idea that the past clings to these hills. Loretta occasionally checks on me, sometimes sharing stories of other times people encountered spectral children or heard old war drums echoing in the hollows. Miguel plans to visit soon with more kayak customers, and I'll happily share a mug of coffee with him, grateful for a friend who believed me when it mattered. Every so often, as dusk falls, I think I catch a faint strain of humming, but it might just be the wind weaving through the pines. I've learned not to fear it. This place holds heartbreak in its soil, the memories of centuries. I'm only one person passing through, a caretaker for a time. If I can honor those who came before, show them a bit of kindness, maybe I can finally find the solace I sought when I fled the city. And when the nights are darkest, I simply remind myself I am here to listen, not to run. The land remembers, and in remembering, perhaps it can find a measure of rest. I still remember the first time I tried to cook a gumbo in a big city restaurant. It was years ago, in a swanky place in Chicago where white tablecloths and tiny garnishes ruled. The owners wanted to add Cajun flair to the menu, and I, eager and ambitious, obliged. But as I stirred the roux under fluorescent lights, listening to the clink of champagne flutes, something in me felt hollow. Sure, the gumbo turned out decent enough, but it wasn't the same. I'd spent my childhood in Louisiana, where the scent of onion and bell pepper mingled with the humid air, where you could hear crickets and bullfrogs outside the kitchen door, where gumbo was made slowly, soulfully. The city took that away from me. By the time I turned 30, I was a head chef in a high-end spot, but my heart felt drained. I missed home, the real home, with its cypress knees rising from the water, Spanish moss swaying in the breeze, and the sound of accordions at every family gathering. So I quit. I gathered my savings, said goodbye to my fancy apron, and drove south until the highways turned into narrow roads lined with sugarcane fields. And finally, I found a little slice of land near Lake Martin, on the edges of the bayou I grew up hearing stories about. A rickety raised cabin stood there, half drowned by decades of flooding, but still strong at its core. It reminded me a little of myself. I arrived in mid-September, the air thick with heat that smelled of brackish water and wildflowers. My auntie used to tell me that this land was alive with spirits, some that could bless you with good fortune, and others that might leave you trembling in the dark. As a child, I'd laugh it off. As an adult, worn by years away, I wasn't so sure. Still, I climbed the crooked steps, listened to the boards creak underfoot, and decided this was it. My new home, a place to rekindle my love for cooking and my connection to my Cajun roots. Life in the bayou wasn't glamorous, but it felt honest. The cabin was little more than a wood frame perched on pilings to avoid floodwaters. Beneath the planks, the bayou lapped in slow, steady waves, teeming with life, gators, fish, snakes, and critters I couldn't name. My first few days, I spent cleaning out cobwebs, repairing the old propane stove, and setting up a rudimentary off-grid system of solar panels for lights and a small fridge. At night, the frogs croaked lullabies, fireflies danced over the water, and I breathed in air that felt both heavy and comforting. Still, the old stories lingered in my mind. Tales of drowned spirits haunting these waterways, of eerie lights flickering in the swamp at dusk, of lost children singing mournful songs among the cypress. Auntie swore she'd once seen a pale figure drift across the bayou, crying like a banshee, and Mama Chantel, a revered hoodoo practitioner living deeper in the marsh, had been known to help folks ward off things that crept at night. I tried not to think too hard about it. I had real concerns. How to get enough groceries with the nearest store half an hour away, how to keep mosquitoes from devouring me, and how to use the old pirogue, a narrow canoe, to navigate the swamp if I wanted to gather fresh herbs. By my second week, I'd settled into a rhythm of slow mornings and creative afternoons. I'd experiment with classic Cajun recipes, etouffee, jambalaya, shrimp, and grits, tinkering with spices as I watched the sun shimmer on Lake Martin. The quiet revived me. Here, the only chatter came from birds, insects, and the occasional boat chugging by. My days felt full, but not frantic. But the bayou is never just peaceful. It has a pulse, a secret undercurrent that can turn on you when you least expect it. The first sign of something off came on a stormy night, rain pounding the tin roof in a staccato rhythm. I was ladling leftover gumbo into a bowl when I caught a glimpse of movement outside the cabin window. Lightning flashed, revealing a shape passing through the cypress knees. Alligator? Could be, but it seemed too tall, upright like a person wading in chest-deep water. Another flash lit the swamp, and there was nothing there. I told myself my eyes were playing tricks, but a knot of unease formed in my belly. The next morning, I discovered half a dozen dead crawfish scattered on my porch, arranged in a peculiar circular pattern. My heart kicked. An animal might do that, but it felt almost too deliberate. I stared at the bright red shells, torn and wet, then swept them off the edge into the bayou. A sour taste lingered in my mouth as I remembered old superstitions about curses and marsh spirits. A few days later, as dusk settled, I got into my pirogue to check the crab traps I'd set earlier. The water was placid, reflecting the orange sky. Lake Martin stretched out to the east, a vast mirror fringed by cypress trees draped with moss. Dragonflies darted, and the occasional splash hinted at fish or gators lurking below. Then I heard it, a child's voice singing, soft and high-pitched, drifting over the still water. My paddle froze mid-stroke. I turned toward the sound. It was coming from somewhere near the far edge of the lake, past a thicket of reeds. Goosebumps rose on my arms in the steamy air. I called out, "Hello? You okay?" The singing stopped. I stared at the darkening stand of cypress, heart pounding, but saw no one. Minutes passed, and the sun dipped lower, painting the sky blood red. With a trembling sigh, I paddled back to my cabin, the tune echoing in my mind. Maybe a local child playing a prank. But something about that voice, wordless and haunting, made me doubt it. I decided I needed to talk to Mama Chantel. I'd heard she lived on a spit of land deep in the bayou, accessible only by boat. My cousin Remy, who dropped by occasionally, confirmed she was still around, an old woman with eyes that seemed to see right through you. "But watch yourself," Remy warned. "She don't like visitors unannounced. Best bring an offering or something." So, one muggy afternoon, I paddled out in the pirogue with a small basket of fresh peppers and herbs I'd grown, hoping that might soften her disposition. The journey took me through winding channels, past silent groves of cypress. Spanish moss trailed like ghosts above my head. At last, I spotted a rickety shack perched on raised timbers, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Mama Chantel stepped onto her porch, arms crossed, as if she already knew I was coming. She was old, skin like wrinkled parchment, hair wrapped in a patterned scarf, and eyes sharp as a hawk. Wordlessly, she beckoned me inside. The shack smelled of incense and dried plants. Dolls and charms dangled from the rafters. I tried not to stare, instead offering my basket with trembling hands. She nodded, set it aside, and motioned for me to speak. My words tumbled out. Dead crawfish arranged on my porch, a child's voice singing at twilight, a silhouette in the rain. Mama Chantel listened with an intensity that made me feel both exposed and oddly comforted. When I finished, she stirred a small pot of herbs on her stove, the steam pungent. "The bayou's full of spirits," she said, her voice raspy. "Some lost, some restless. They latch onto sorrow, anger, guilt, whatever they can find." I admitted I felt guilt about leaving home for so long, about losing my sense of heritage in city kitchens. She nodded, as if that explained everything. She plucked a pouch of ground herbs from a shelf, mixed it with coarse salt, and handed me the blend. "Sprinkle this around your cabin, especially near doors and windows. Light these 2 candles at dusk for 7 nights." She placed 2 black candles in my hands. "Speak your intentions. Ask the spirits to let you be, and don't show fear. Fear is a welcome mat to those that prowl the bayou's shadows." I thanked her, uncertain but grateful for any guidance. That night I followed her instructions. I sprinkled the salt and herbs around my cabin's perimeter, muttering a half-formed prayer. The swamp buzzed with cicadas, and the sun sank into the cypress. Then, as darkness gathered, I lit the black candles on my porch, the flames dancing in the humid air. My heart hammered, but I forced calm, telling whatever might be listening that I meant no harm, that I asked for peace in my ancestral land. Finally, I went inside, locking the door with trembling hands. At first, nothing happened. The night wore on, stifling and quiet. Around midnight, though, the air grew thick, and the familiar singing drifted from the water's edge. Softer this time, almost tentative. I peered out the window, but saw only the flicker of candlelight on the porch, illuminating a haze of insects swirling in the glow. Slowly, the singing faded, replaced by the hoot of a barred owl. Relief uncoiled in my chest. Perhaps the ritual was working. Each subsequent evening, I repeated the process. Salt, herbs, candles, murmured intentions. The sense of unease diminished. No more crawfish carcasses, no more fleeting silhouettes. One evening, Remy swung by, and I told him about my visits to Mama Chantel and the child's voice. He just shook his head, muttering, "That's the bayou for you. Always has secrets. Glad you're finding a way to cope." By the 7th night of the candle ritual, the bayou felt almost serene. I stood on my porch, listening to the distant croaking of frogs, the occasional plop of something diving under the surface. A pale moon rose over the cypress, illuminating the tangled moss in silvery threads. I breathed in the earthy scent, feeling more connected to this place than I had to anywhere else in years. Then, just as I blew out the final candle, a gentle rustling caught my ear, a shape gliding through the water. My heart pounded, but I held steady, remembering Mama Chantel's words about fear. A faint shimmer revealed what looked like a small figure, half submerged, drifting along the shoreline. Smooth motion, no splash. For a second, we locked eyes, though I couldn't discern a face, just a suggestion of features in the moonlight. It might have been a trick of the shadows, but I sensed a sad longing. I felt tears well up, an ache for lost souls, for old wounds this bayou still carried. I closed my eyes, whispered, "I'm sorry," and when I looked again, the figure was gone, the water rippling where it had passed. After that night, no more eerie songs floated through my windows. The bayou, however, remained its usual self, mysterious, teeming with life, occasionally gifting me with glimpses of alligators sliding into the water, or herons gliding overhead. Yet there was a gentler undercurrent, like whatever restless spirit lurked here had found a fragile peace, or maybe just realized I wasn't a threat. I found my own peace, too, rediscovering that slow, patient joy of Cajun, cooking without the clamoring demands of a big city. I practiced making roux until it was nutty brown perfection, letting the flavors meld while cicadas hummed outside. Sometimes Remy visited to taste test, praising my gumbo as the best he'd had in years. At other times, I'd boat over to Mama Chantel's shack, trading fresh peppers for her wisdom in the form of cryptic quips. She rarely offered direct answers, but her presence felt like a protective aura over the bayou. Late autumn brought cooler air, thinning the mosquitoes. I built a modest herb garden on a raised platform behind the cabin, planting thyme, basil, and local seasoning peppers. On weekends, I'd venture into Lafayette, or Breaux Bridges farmers markets, selling small batches of homemade spice blends I created. People asked about my location. Lake Martin, they'd say. "Oh, you must get plenty of spooky stories." I'd just smile and nod, knowing I carried one of my own, though it felt too personal to share outright. Sometimes at twilight, I'll stand on the porch, a cup of chicory coffee warming my hands, and watch the sun slip behind the cypress. The bayou's hush wraps around me, a lullaby of crickets and softly lapping water. Now and then, I recall that trembling evening when the child's voice drifted across the lake, the hush of a presence that wanted to be heard. And I think about how, in honoring the land's mysteries, I found healing for my own. I don't claim to understand all the forces that swirl in these swamps, but I've learned to respect them, to offer a dish of thanks to the land that feeds and shelters me, to never assume I'm the only one here. My cousin Remy likes to say that living in the bayou means sharing space with the living and the long gone. Mama Chantel calls it balance. I call it home. And so, I remain in my raised cabin, stirring pots of gumbo that taste more real and heartfelt than any fancy version I ever made in a distant city. My days flow with the bayou's rhythms, and my nights float on a gentle darkness that feels more like a lullaby than a threat. It's a place where old curses might roam, but also where forgiveness and acceptance can thrive, where the past whispers through the cypress, and we listen, not in fear, but in reverence. After all, this land and I belong to each other now, bound by the steam of a simmering pot and the silent wails of a midnight swamp. And in that bond, I found a peace I never knew I was missing.